Morning of July 29th, 1981, was the kind of morning that makes liars out of weather forecasters. London had been overcast for days, the kind of English grey that settles into the city like an uninvited guest and refuses to leave regardless of how politely you ignore it. Then, something lifted, and by 6 in the morning the light had turned gold over the rooftops of Westminster. The city began filling with people who had been sleeping in the streets for 3 days to claim a good spot along the route to St. Paul's Cathedral. Inside Clarence House, the work had been going on since before sunrise. Dresser, who had been in royal service for 11 years, said later that she had never seen a bride who cried so much in the hours before a wedding. She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way people describe things that troubled them and that they never fully resolved. Crying was not nerves, she said. She had seen nerves. Nerves have a different quality, a physical agitation, flushing and a trembling and a tendency to laugh too quickly at nothing. This was something different. This was a young woman sitting very still in front of a mirror, while hands she did not know finished her hair. Stillness was the stillness of someone who had made a decision they could no longer unmake. Diana Frances Spencer was 20 years old. She had known the man she was about to marry for approximately 15 months, had spent fewer than a dozen genuine evenings alone with him, had been publicly engaged to him for 5 months, during which the photographs that ran in every newspaper in the world showed a couple who looked exactly like what a fairy tale requires. She smiled. He smiled. The gap in ages, 13 years, barely registered against the weight of the public's investment in the story it had decided to believe. Staff at Clarence House knew things the cameras could not show. A footman who worked in the lower household said years later that Diana had asked question quietly the night before the wedding that none of the senior staff knew how to answer. She had not asked it loudly. She had not asked it in any way that required the person she asked to treat it as a formal concern. She asked it in the corridor, passing, if it were a thought she had just had and could not hold in any longer. The question was whether she would be allowed, any point in the marriage, to have friends of her own choosing, friends who were not selected or approved by the palace, friends who would be loyal to her rather than to the institution. No one answered her. Footman said the question passed through the corridor, the way uncomfortable questions pass in formal households, absorbed by the walls, filed somewhere no one would ever retrieve. The dresser who helped her into the wedding gown, the manual dress that was already slightly crumpled from being folded into the carriage, noticed that Diana's hands were cold and very steady. She had stopped crying by the time the gown went on. The steadiness was what the dresser remembered most clearly. She had steadied herself, the way people steady themselves when they have decided to go through with something regardless of what they feel about it. Quality, the performed steadiness over an interior that was anything but steady, would become the central fact of everything that followed. Before we go further, if you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment to do that now and press the notification bell. Everything we cover here comes from documented accounts, published testimony, and the words of the people who were present inside rooms where history was made. It is one of those stories that has been managed for a very long time. What we are going to do today is look at what the management has worked hard to keep in the background. Marriage of Charles Philip Arthur George Windsor and Diana Frances Spencer lasted 15 years on paper. It lasted significantly less than that in every other sense. The people who lived and worked in close proximity to both of them understood this much earlier than the public did, partly because institutions are designed to make the private lives of their most important members invisible to anyone, not have a specific reason to look, and partly because the staff who saw what they saw had signed agreements and carried fears about what closure would cost them, and so the knowledge accumulated in service corridors and changed rooms and the back offices of royal residences for years before any of it reached the public in a form that allowed the public to receive it as real. Staff saw is the story the official record worked hardest to contain. It is also the story that matters most, because private suffering is more historically significant than public policy or institutional decision-making. The suffering of the people involved in this marriage shaped both of those things in ways the record has not yet fully measured. Because the gap between what the institution presented to the world and what was happening inside the walls of Kensington Palace and Highgrove, Balmoral and the other royal residences across the 15 years of this marriage is a gap that tells you exactly how the institution understood itself and what it was willing to do to the people inside it in order to preserve the image it had decided to project. Diana knew things very early, earlier than the public understood, earlier than Charles seems to have anticipated she would know. She gathered knowledge the way a person who has grown up inside a household governed by secrets learns to gather it carefully, without announcing the gathering, without acting on what she knew until the moment when acting on it was the only option she had left. Knowledge began with the bracelet. Several people who were part of the household at the time of the engagement have described the bracelet in accounts given years apart and with consistent detail. Charles had commissioned it. It was a gold chain with a blue enamel disc. The enamel disc had letters on it. The letters were G and F intertwined, and they stood for Girl Friday, which was the name Charles used privately for Camilla Parker Bowles in the years before the marriage, when the relationship they maintained required a name that was not her actual name. Diana found out about the bracelet before the wedding. Accounts differ on whether she saw it directly or was told by a member of the household staff. The accounts agree on is that the bracelet was intended as a parting gift, presented to Camilla in the days immediately before the wedding to Charles. The gesture was understood by everyone who knew about it for exactly what it was. A man saying goodbye to one woman while marrying another. Goodbye was the kind that contains inside it a promise to return. She confronted him about it. This is documented in multiple sources, including the account Andrew Morton compiled in the years before his book was published in 1992. Diana recorded her own testimony on a series of audio tapes in a room at Kensington Palace with no one else present. Tapes existed in Morton's possession for years before Diana's death, and what she said on them about this specific incident was precise and specific in the way that real memory is precise and specific. Reconstructed clarity of a story told so many times it has calcified into a set piece, but the jagged, slightly provisional clarity of something a person is still working out how to understand even as they describe it. She said that Charles told her the bracelet was a goodbye. She said she did not believe him. She said she knew, in the way that a person who has spent their early years navigating a household governed by concealment knows things. The goodbye was not a goodbye, but a temporary separation. She said she asked him directly whether his relationship with Camilla was what she believed it to be. She said he did not answer the question with anything she could hold on to. The wedding went ahead 3 days later. Staff at Clarence House and at Buckingham Palace, who were involved in the preparation for the wedding, had various degrees of knowledge about the situation. A few of the more senior household members, those with long service and close proximity to Charles, knew the shape of things very well. Dresser, who served one of the senior royal ladies, said that there was a specific awareness among a small number of women in the upper household. Prince of Wales was entering a marriage under conditions that were not what the public was being told they were. The awareness was not discussed openly. This is the quality of knowledge inside royal households that distinguishes it from ordinary institutional knowledge. In other institutions, when people know something damaging about a senior figure, there are various mechanisms by which that knowledge can be processed or raised. Inside the palace, the mechanisms do not exist for that purpose. They exist to keep knowledge in its proper compartment, and the compartment for this kind of knowledge was the compartment labeled private. Private meant it went nowhere, so the dresser who knew went about her work. The footman who had heard the question in the corridor went about his. Household carried its knowledge into the morning of July 29th like a piece of furniture. Everyone had agreed to step around. Ceremony lasted 32 minutes. The carriage ride to St. Paul's was 20 minutes. 2,500 people sat inside the cathedral. 600,000 people lined the route. 1 billion people watched on television. Numbers were reported in every newspaper the following day, as evidence of the fairy tale, proof that the world had collectively decided to believe in something, and the belief was real, genuine. Specific warmth of people who wanted very much for a particular story to be true. Staff who watched the service from the positions available to them in the cathedral saw different things from what the cameras caught. A man who served as a junior equerry at the time and who gave a detailed interview to a royal historian, years later described watching Charles's face during the ceremony. He described the particular quality of attention Charles paid to the service, attentive in the formal sense, present in the ceremonial sense, doing everything that was required with the practiced correctness of someone who has spent their entire life being required to perform public ceremonies with precision. But there was something underneath the correctness that the equerry found difficult to name. He tried several descriptions before settling on the phrase that he thought was most accurate. He said Charles looked like a man who was being held still by the weight of everyone watching him. Diana looked at Charles during the exchange of vows, the equerry said. Charles looked at the middle distance. Honeymoon was on the royal yacht Britannia. It sailed from Gibraltar on the 1st of August, through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and on toward Balmoral, where the couple would spend the autumn portion of their honeymoon in Scotland. Voyage took several weeks. The yacht had a large and experienced crew, and the crew maintained the discretion that royal service required. Meant that very little of what they observed made it into the public record. What did make it into various accounts, including the testimony Diana gave to Morton, and the broader pattern of accounts from people who spoke years later, that the honeymoon on Britannia was where the marriage's central problem became unavoidable, in a way that could not be explained away by nerves, or adjustment, or the usual difficulties of two people learning to live together for the first time. Camilla's presence on the ship was not physical. Camilla's presence was constant. Charles kept a journal on the voyage. He had kept journals since his years at Gordonstoun, and the practice was part of the discipline of his life. Regular and serious, and considered his private record in a way that the palace treated as inviolable. Diana, by her own account, found the journal one afternoon and read several entries. What the entries contained, as she described it later, not a straightforward account of a man on his honeymoon, with a woman he had married and was learning to love. Entries contained references to Camilla, not in any explicit or incriminating form, but present consistently in a way that told Diana, who was already paying attention, in the specific way of someone who has grown up inside concealment. The man she had married had not left anyone behind. The staff on Britannia noticed things. Crew members who later gave accounts, always carefully hedged in the way accounts from people still constrained by loyalty agreements are hedged, described a couple who did not behave on a yacht like people who were in the first weeks of a marriage they had been anticipating. Were separate routines very early. Charles's schedule on the ship was his own. He read, he painted, he wrote. Diana attempted to enter his routines and found them already fully formed, structured around his own preferences in a way that had no particular space for a companion. Steward, who served on Britannia across multiple royal voyages, said that the thing he noticed on the Wales honeymoon, compared to other royal travel he had observed, was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of two people who are at ease with each other. Kind of silence that forms when two people are working out a problem that neither of them has named yet. They arrived at Balmoral in mid-August. Royal family gathered in the usual Balmoral formation. The Queen and Prince Philip, Princess Anne, the wider household. Formal photographs taken at this time showed exactly what photographs at Balmoral are designed to show. A family, the continuation of a dynasty, settled surface of an institution that has survived worse things than bad weather and difficult adjustments. Diana would later say that the Balmoral autumn of 1981 was the period when she understood what she had married into. She said it in terms that were specific about the quality of the understanding. She did not say she understood that Charles did not love her. That understanding was present. She said she understood the institution. She said she understood that the institution was not a family in any sense she recognized, that it operated by rules that were not explained to her. Loyalty inside it ran not to the people inside the marriage, but to the structure that contained the marriage, that the structure had its own requirements which took precedence over the comfort, or the clarity, or the health of any individual inside it. 20 years old, she had come from a background that included considerable personal turmoil, a broken home, parents whose separation had shaped her childhood in ways that would not be fully visible to anyone around her until much later. She had no formal preparation for the role she had taken. The palace's preparation of her for the marriage and its public duties had been cursory in way that the preparation of royal brides in that era was customarily cursory, because the assumption was that a sufficiently well-bred young woman would absorb what she needed to know from the environment itself, from proximity to people who knew the rules, from the instinctive formation that came from the right sort of background. Diana's background had given her things the palace had not accounted for, had given her an emotional acuity that came from surviving the specific childhood she had survived, and it had given her a hunger for connection, for love that was actual rather than formal, that the institution was constitutionally incapable of providing. To understand what happened inside the Wales marriage, you have to understand where Diana came from. The story that the institution preferred for her was the story of the girl who rose, young woman of good family who found herself called to a great destiny, and who met that destiny with grace. That story contains some truth. She did come from good family. She did meet the public dimension of her destiny with extraordinary grace eventually, in a way no one had predicted and the palace had not anticipated or prepared for. The girl who was summoned by that destiny came from a house that had broken when she was 6 years old. Breaking had left marks that the official story was not interested in, because the official story required a certain kind of surface. Surfaces do not accommodate marks. Park House is a large square Victorian building on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, on land leased from the Crown. It is the kind of house that describes a certain kind of English family, comfortable, established, set within parkland, that speaks of long tenure, and the kind of security that comes from not having had to think too hard about money for several generations. Diana Frances Spencer was born there on the 1st of July 1961. She was the third daughter. Her parents had wanted a son. Her older brother John had been born the previous year and had lived for 10 hours. Death had introduced into the Spencer marriage a grief and a pressure that the marriage, which was already less stable than its public presentation suggested, was not well equipped to carry. Her father was John Spencer, Viscount Althorpe, a man of correct bearing and considerable land, and a relationship with emotional expressiveness that was characteristic of his generation and his class he did not find feeling easy to demonstrate. This was not presented as a failing in his world, it was presented as nothing at all. Because in the world John Spencer inhabited, the stoicism that kept feeling contained was the default condition of being a man of his type. Departures from it were the exception rather than the standard. Her mother was Frances Roche, daughter of the 4th Baron Fermoy, a woman who had married at 18, and who had spent the years since that marriage discovering that the life she had married into, and the life she actually wanted, were not the same life. Frances was warm and physically affectionate in ways her husband was not. Gap between them in that respect was not something either of them had found a way to close. Diana was aware enough of her environment to register these things. The gap had become something else, something harder and more fixed. Frances left in 1967. Diana was 6. The leaving was not clean. It could not have been given the specific circumstances. Frances had fallen in love with another man, Peter Shand Kidd, heir to a wallpaper fortune. The leaving was therefore a leaving of both the marriage and its entire moral framework in the eyes of the class and era it took place in. Custody dispute that followed was vicious in its specific cruelty. Frances's own mother, Lady Fermoy, testified against her daughter in court. Testimony contributed to John Spencer being awarded custody of all 4 children. Frances was left with weekend access, she exercised faithfully, and which Diana experienced as the particular pain of a child who learns to count the days until a parent returns and watches them leave again. What this produced in Diana is something that various people who knew her well have described from different angles. Brother Charles Spencer described the childhood as agonizing and ruptured. Her protection officers and domestic staff, in accounts given after her death, described a woman whose emotional patterns had been formed by the specific experience of having been abandoned by the person she most needed, who spent the rest of her life looking for the reassurance that the abandonment had not been deserved, who was capable of enormous warmth precisely because she understood from the inside what its absence felt like. Did not finish school in any formal sense. She failed her O-levels twice and left West Heath at 16 without the qualifications that would marked academic competence. The narrative that formed around this fact, the one the palace and later the press were happy to circulate. Diana was not particularly intelligent, that she was sweet and warm and lovely but not complicated, that she was, in slightly patronizing formulation that even some sympathetic accounts used, more heart than head. This was a serious misreading. It was also a useful one for people who needed her to be manageable. The specific intelligence Diana possessed was not the kind that showed well in examinations. It was the intelligence of someone who reads people with extraordinary precision, understands atmospheres and power dynamics in rooms the way other people understand printed texts, who learned early that survival in her world required a constant high-level monitoring of what the people around her were feeling and what they needed from her. This is not academic intelligence, it is considerably rarer. By the time she was working in London in the late 1970s, sharing a flat in Colquhoun Court with friends from her circle, helping at a kindergarten in Pimlico. Intelligence was there in the form it had taken. She was extraordinarily perceptive about people. She was funny, in the direct, slightly irreverent way of someone who has not yet learned to suppress the first honest response. She was physical in her warmth, touching people easily, making the specific contact that her background had made her hunger for. She was lonely in a way that the surface of her life, surrounded by friends, active and busy and likable, did not show. She had watched her older sister Sarah go through a period of involvement with the Prince of Wales. Sarah Spencer had been in a relationship with Charles for a few months in 1977 before the involvement ended, and Sarah told the press about it, which was the kind of thing that did not lead to royal marriages. Diana had been present at the edges of that relationship, younger, quieter, less obvious. The introduction to Charles, when it finally came, during a shooting weekend at Althorpe in November 1980, arrived in a context Diana understood better than Charles understood. She understood it. She was 19. She wore a tweedy skirt and a thick sweater, and had not yet become the person she would later become in public. Charles was 31. He was looking, under the sustained pressure of a family, and an institution that had been telling him for years that he needed to produce an heir, for a wife. The qualities he was looking for, or more precisely the qualities the palace and the Queen's advisors were looking for on his behalf, were specific and in some respects peculiar. The candidate had to be of suitable background, meaning aristocratic or at minimum upper-class English in the manner that Charles's world recognized. She had to be young, meaning young enough that questions about her past were unlikely to surface in the form of previous serious relationships. Palace of that era had a specific and uncomfortable understanding of what was required in terms of a prospective bride's personal history. That understanding required a woman who came to the marriage without the kind of complications that previous relationships produced. She had to be, in the language people around the palace used at the time, suitable. Diana Spencer was suitable. She was 19 years old. She had had no serious romantic relationships that the press or the palace knew about. Came from a family with long connections to the royal household. Her maternal grandmother, Lady Fermoy, close confidant of the Queen Mother, and had, by accounts that emerged later, actively encouraged the union. Background was correct in every dimension. The palace required a background to be correct. The palace had not thought particularly hard about was what was behind the background. The childhood, the abandonment, emotional education of a girl who had learned to survive inside a house that broke, specific hunger for love that the suitability criteria had not registered as relevant. Charles met Diana in November of 1980 on the shooting weekend at Althorpe. By February of 1981, after a courtship that consisted of approximately 13 meetings and a sequence of carefully managed encounters at various country houses and royal residences, the engagement was announced. The speed was partly the product of the institutional pressure on Charles. He was 32. Palace had been handling the combination of his age and his unmarried status as a problem for years. Speed was also partly the product of something in the dynamic between Charles and Diana in those early months that several people who were around at the time have described in similar terms. Diana pursued him, in the specific sense of making herself available and receptive and warm, in a way that Charles responded to, and Charles was at least partly drawn to the enthusiasm of a young woman, who clearly found him compelling when other women of more experience and more confidence had found him complicated. Anna Wallace, who had come close to marrying him in 1980 and had famously walked away from him at a ball that August because he had ignored her for most evening in favor of spending it with Camilla, was a woman who saw Charles clearly and decided the clarity was too much to live with. Diana, 19, did not have Anna Wallace's clarity. She had something else, a genuine romantic feeling for him, genuine belief that the story was what it looked like, and the specific inexperience that allowed her to hold that belief in the face of evidence a more practiced observer would have read differently. The dresser who helped with the preparations said later that Diana's happiness in the of the engagement was real. She was not performing. The photographs from that period, the ones where Diana looks genuinely lit up, not manufactured. She believed in what she was entering. The institution had supplied a story, and Diana had supplied the belief that made the story true for as long as the belief could hold. It could not hold for long. The bracelet was the first major piece of evidence. Honeymoon journals were the second. The phone calls were the third, and the third was the one that changed everything. did not change anything immediately, because Diana had learned very early the specific discipline of knowing something and carrying the knowledge without acting on it until acting became the only option. The phone calls began, by various accounts, very early in the marriage. Charles maintained his correspondence with Camilla and his contact with her with a consistency that some of those around him later described as a failure to fully understand the implications of what he was doing. He was a man who had had a particular relationship for several years, interrupted it at the palace's insistence because the demands of his position required a suitable wife, had married a suitable wife, and had then, apparently with the specific blindness of someone who compartmentalizes with great efficiency, resumed the relationship because the emotional requirement that it met had not been met by the marriage and was not being met by anything else. Household at Highgrove, the country house in Gloucestershire that was Charles's principal country residence, was the location where the parallel life was most visible to the staff. Camilla Parker Bowles was a neighbour. She lived at Bolyhyde Manor, was nearby. The logistics of maintaining contact were simpler in the country than in London. Local household staff had a different relationship to the family's private life from the more formal London staff at Kensington Palace. Some of them had connections to Camilla through the social world of that part of Gloucestershire. Several of them had worked at Highgrove before the marriage and understood the way long-service rural staff understand the lives of the families they work for, that this house had a particular history. Former member of the Highgrove outdoor staff, interviewed years later in a context that allowed him to speak without identifying himself, described the routine that developed. Camilla would visit the house. The visits were not hidden exactly. They were not scheduled in the formal way that visits to a royal household are typically scheduled. Happened in the gaps in the formal calendar. The staff learned the rhythm of them. Was a particular quality to the house on days when she came. The staff described it, in various accounts, as a loosening. Charles was looser, formal, less careful about the particular performance that he maintained in his domestic life with Diana. Diana was not at Highgrove on most of the days when these visits happened. This was not accidental. Schedules were managed in a way that produced the separation, without requiring anyone to acknowledge the management. She was not unaware of it. Specific quality of awareness Diana brought to her marriage was not the naive awareness of someone who does not know what to look for. It was the finely tuned awareness of someone who had grown up inside a household where things were not said and who had learned young to read the things that were not said from the things that were. The phone call happened at Kensington Palace, probably in the early years of the marriage, 1982 or 83. Diana's own account, recorded for Morton on the audio tapes she made in her bedroom, placed it in this period. She described picking up a telephone extension and hearing Charles's voice. She described the register of the voice, specific quality of intimacy in it that she had never heard him use with her. She placed the receiver down quietly after a short time. She did not announce herself on the line. She carried the knowledge into the rest of the marriage. This moment of the phone call and the silence that followed it, is the structural center of everything that came after. The bracelet before the wedding, not the Highgrove visits, not the separate schedules or the increasingly parallel lives. Phone call is the center because it was the moment when Diana's knowledge became complete. She had suspected she had gathered pieces. Phone call was the piece that made the picture whole. And from that moment the marriage was something she understood in its full shape. A shape that was very different from the shape the public was being shown. Understanding why she did not confront him, why she carried the knowledge in silence for so long, requires understanding where she was at the moment she heard it. 21 years old. Married less than 2 years, inside an institution where her support staff reported to the palace rather than to her. Without a single person around her who was not in some way enmeshed in the institutional structure that had produced her marriage and that would protect the institution's interests over hers if the two came into conflict. Confrontation would have required a language for what she had heard, language that would be believed, a process by which the believing could produce a consequence. None of these things were available to her. Palace did not have a mechanism for addressing this kind of concern from a princess. The palace had a mechanism for managing it. It was a different thing. Managing meant containing the knowledge, ensuring it did not reach the public, ensuring the surface of the marriage remained presentable to the world that was watching it. Diana understood this with a precision that came partly from her emotional intelligence and partly from the specific experience of the previous 2 years inside the institution. She understood that speaking the knowledge out loud into the palace's management structure would not produce a solution, it would produce a management operation directed at her. She chose silence. She chose it not out of passivity but out of calculation. Specific calculation of someone who has very little power and understands that the power they have will be most effective if it is not spent, for the moment when spending it will produce the maximum result. The silence lasted 13 years. During those 13 years, she raised 2 children, performed thousands of public engagements, became the most photographed woman in the world, built a public standing that the palace had not anticipated and could not fully control, carried the knowledge of what her marriage actually was with a consistency that the people around her could see in the specific quality of her private moods without being able to name what they were seeing. The staff who worked most closely with Diana at Kensington Palace during those years describe across multiple accounts given at various points after her death. Woman who inhabited 2 lives simultaneously with extraordinary efficiency. The public life was the life the world saw and the world loved. Private life was something else. Paul Burrell, who became her butler in 1987 and served as her principal domestic attendant till her death in 1997, described the household at Kensington Palace in terms that are consistent with other accounts but more detailed than most, because his proximity and his role gave him access to the texture of her daily life that other members of staff did not have. He described a woman who was, in private, both more fragile and more formidable than the public presentation suggested. Fragile in the ways that her childhood and her marriage and the specific pressures of her position had made her fragile. Formidable in the ways that surviving those things had made her formidable. The household at Kensington Palace occupied apartments 8 and 9. Not large by royal standards. The domestic staff was smaller than the households of some other senior royals. Diana had chosen staff who were, in various ways, personally loyal to her rather than to the institution, which was itself a departure from the standard royal household pattern, and which the palace noticed and was not entirely comfortable with. Charles occupied apartments at Kensington Palace as well, later moving his primary London residence to St James's Palace. In the early years of the marriage, the household at Kensington was formally shared, meaning the couple maintained the same address for official purposes, while operating increasingly separate domestic lives within it. Staff who worked in the shared corridors of the palace during the mid-1980s described the specific geography of a marriage that had stopped functioning as a unit while maintaining all the external forms of a functioning unit. The dining room was used for formal meals. On evenings when both principals were at the palace and there was no public engagement, dinner was served. Staff who laid the table and served the meal and cleared it away afterward described these dinners in terms that were consistent across multiple counts. The meals were formally correct. The conversation was minimal. Politeness had the quality of politeness between people who have agreed to be polite as an alternative to something they do not want to do in front of the staff. A footman who worked on the Wales household for 3 years in the middle of the decade described eating his own supper in the kitchen below and being able to hear occasionally the sounds of the dining room above him. He could not hear words. He could hear the rhythm of speech, and the rhythm during the formal dinners had a quality he struggled to describe but settled on the phrase, carefully managed, like 2 people who had decided in advance on the exact level of engagement they would bring, and were executing that decision with precision. The fights were different. They were not frequent in the accounts that have emerged. The marriage was not one of constant open conflict. Open conflict, when it came, was the release of pressure that had been building in the silence between formal dinners and separate schedules and specific daily reality of a house in which 2 people had entirely different understandings of what their marriage was. Paul Burrell's account of the fights, detailed in his memoir and in subsequent interviews, includes the specific image that has attached itself to the public memory of the Wales marriage as clearly as any other. Charles covered in salad dressing. It happened during one of the arguments that took place in the upper rooms of the palace, out of sight of the formal household but not out of earshot of the staff who were working nearby. Diana, by Burrell's account, overturned a table during the confrontation, and the contents of the table, which had been set for a private meal, went with it. Charles stood with salad dressing on his jacket. He looked, Burrell said, more embarrassed than anything else. Embarrassed by the loss of control in the room and by the specific humiliation of the moment. It was not a marriage in which Charles was immune to the damage of what was happening. The official account, one that the rehabilitation narrative constructed in later years, cast him as the primary agent and Diana as the primary victim. Counting is broadly correct in terms of the structure of what happened. The staff who were present in the household across the years of the marriage describe something more complicated than a simple division of agent and victim. They describe two people who were genuinely unsuited to each other, who had been placed inside a container that was too rigid to accommodate the incompatibility, who damaged each other across years in ways that were not always unilateral. Was the fundamental condition that produced everything else. Charles had entered the marriage with a prior commitment that Diana did not know the full extent of when she entered it. That commitment had not ended with the marriage. The parallel relationship with Camilla was the condition inside which everything else in the marriage happened, and the condition was not one Diana had agreed to, or been consulted about, or prepared for. It was the condition Charles had brought to the marriage from the beginning, and had maintained through everything that followed. Staff understood this. The ones who had been in service long enough and had sufficient proximity understood the basic shape of what was happening, could not address it. They could not raise it with the principals, or with the palace management. They could do was observe it, and carry the observation in the specific silence that royal service required. Lady's maid who worked in the Wales household for 2 years in the mid-1980s said, in an interview given much later, the thing she found hardest was the asymmetry. Diana, she said, genuinely tried to make the marriage work. She described Diana going through periods of determined effort to connect with Charles, to find the common ground, be the kind of wife who interested him. The effort was real. The lady's maid could see the effort, and could also see that it was being made against a current that was not Diana's fault, and that no amount of effort was going to reverse. William was born on June 21, 1882. The birth was the subject of enormous public attention. Charles was present at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. It was itself a departure from royal tradition, and the photographs taken of the couple leaving the hospital with the new prince were among the reproduced images of that year. Diana looked exhausted and radiant in the way of new mothers. Charles looked proud and slightly overwhelmed in the way of new fathers, who have spent their lives in controlled environments and find the controlled quality of new parenthood slightly difficult to navigate. What Paul Burrell reported about the night Harry was born in September 1984 was different. He said Diana told him that Charles arrived at the hospital after the birth, at the red-haired baby in the cot, and said words that were not the words of a man fully present in the happiness of the moment. He said, Burrell's account of what Diana told him, red hair, I suppose that's a Spencer gene. Diana asked whether he was pleased. He said he was delighted. He said he now had an heir and a spare. Diana told Burrell she knew the marriage was over at that moment. Not that it would end formally, not that the legal structure would dissolve, but that whatever it had been was finished in the sense that mattered. 23 years old. She had been married for 3 years. She was the mother of the 2 boys who would inherit the monarchy. She was also the most photographed woman in the world, which was not an accident and was not entirely the product of the palace's management of her public image. It was partly the product of Diana's own understanding of what the public relationship could give her, that the marriage and the institution could not. The warmth of people who received her as real, who responded to her in the direct way that the palace environment's formal structure did not allow for, who could be touched and who touched her back in a way that was not managed or filtered through institutional requirements. The Australia and New Zealand tour of 1983 was the first major public evidence of the transformation. Diana had gone to Australia nervous and unprepared in specific ways. She came back having understood something about the relationship between herself, public, that no one else in the royal family had fully understood. The public was not responding to the formal presentation. Public was responding to her, to the specific quality of attention she paid to individuals in crowds, crouching down to speak to children at eye level, the holding of hands with people who were ill, tears that appeared at the memorial for the Ash Wednesday bushfire victims, and that were genuine, and were seen to be genuine. Crowds in Australia were unlike anything the royal family had experienced. Response was personal in a way that institutional arrangements do not produce. Was the beginning of the specific phenomenon that would eventually give Diana the public standing she needed to do what she had decided, somewhere in the silence of carrying her knowledge, she would eventually do. Charles watched this. Counts of people who were present on the Australia tour are consistent in their description of the dynamic. Charles was accustomed to public engagement of a particular kind. He was good at it, practiced, skilled in the formal warmth that public appearances required. What he witnessed in Australia was something different. Spontaneous response to his wife that exceeded anything he generated himself. Counts describe him as publicly gracious about it, and privately more conflicted. The conflict was not jealousy in any simple sense. It was something more complicated. The awareness that the marriage the institution had given him had produced a person who was in certain respects more powerful than he had anticipated, whose public standing was already surpassing his own, whose specific way of being in the world was generating a response that the management machinery he had always relied on could not fully contain. He did not know at this point, or chose not to think too hard about, the specific use to which that standing would eventually be put. Diana was still carrying her knowledge in silence. She was still, in the formal sense, trying. Counts from the mid-1980s are consistent in describing a woman who had not yet decided that the silence was unsustainable, who was still looking for the possibility of a functional arrangement within the marriage, even one that was not the marriage she had believed she was entering. What ended that period was not a single event but an accumulation. Highgrove visits that continued through the decade, the schedules that maintained the separation, emotional withdrawal that Charles effected with increasing thoroughness, specific loneliness of a public life that was enormous and a private life that was empty of the thing she most needed, progressive understanding that the institution had no interest in addressing any of this because the institution's interest was in taming the surface, and the surface for the public was intact. The mental health consequences were real and were visible to the staff who were the palace's understanding of mental health in the 1980s was consistent with the era and the class and the institutional culture. Distress was a private matter. It was managed by maintaining composure in public and keeping the private dimension private. Specific symptoms Diana experienced, and she described them herself in detail in the Morton tapes and in the Bashir interview, not interpreted by the institution as something that required professional care or institutional response. They were interpreted as difficulty, instability, as the inconvenient manifestation of a temperament that was proving more complicated than the suitability criteria had promised. Diana's bulimia began in the engagement period, in the weeks after the ring was on her finger and the reality of what she had committed to began to become apparent. It continued through the early years of the marriage and into the decade that followed. It was known to her personal staff. It was known to her protection officers. It was managed in the institutional sense. By not being acknowledged as a condition that required acknowledgement, there were instances of self-harm. These are documented in accounts she gave herself and in testimony from people who were around her during the worst periods. Staff who saw these things and who described them in accounts given after her death do so with the specific care of people who understood what they were witnessing and who also understood that there was no mechanism available to them within the institutional structure for addressing it. Senior member of the domestic staff at Kensington Palace said years later, the hardest thing she witnessed in her years in the household was the specific way the palace handled Diana's distress. He said the handling was not cruel in any simple sense, it was something more insidious. Distress was treated as a management problem, rather than a human one. The question the institution asked, when the question was asked at all, not what does this person need, but what does this person's condition mean for the management of the public presentation. Public presentation was holding. Across the mid-1980s, the Wales marriage presented a surface to the world that the world largely accepted because the world had no particular reason not to accept it. The couple appeared together at public engagements. They were photographed with their sons at Kensington Palace and Highgrove and Balmoral, attended the same events and gave the same interviews in which they said the expected things about family and duty and the specific happiness of their life together. The staff who managed the logistics of these public appearances describe in consistent terms specific work that the presentations required. The schedules were not managed the way a genuinely shared domestic life produces schedules. from a common calendar maintained by two people who are navigating a shared existence. Schedules were managed the way two separate operations are managed when they are required periodically to appear as a single operation. Careful coordination between two separate staffs, careful management of the periods of contact, careful construction of the context in which the contact was to be observed. This took work, real work, ongoing work, specific labor of making a fiction look true to people who are watching it with care because they believe in it and want it to be true. Labor was performed by the staff without acknowledgement, without credit, and without, in most cases, any framework within which to understand their own discomfort with what they were doing. You have stayed with this story so far, and you have found it worth your time. Please subscribe now if you have not already done so and press the notification bell. We have a great deal more of this story to cover. The second half is where the people who were inside this marriage finally stopped protecting the surface and started speaking. Cracks in the surface that had been managed so carefully for so long became visible to the public in 1992, year that would later be described by the Queen herself in her famous Christmas address of that year as an annus horribilis. Phrase is well remembered, less remembered or less frequently examined is the specific sequence of events that produced it. June of 1992, Andrew Morton published a book about Diana. It was called Diana, Her True Story. Based on audio tapes Diana had recorded in her bedroom at Kensington Palace, alone, with a recording device provided through an intermediary. She had recorded the tapes in sessions across the preceding months, speaking about her marriage, her mental health, her relationship with Charles, situation with Camilla, and the institution's handling of all of these things, candor that the institution would later describe as a profound betrayal. The recording was arranged through James Colthurst, friend who had known Diana since childhood and who acted as the intermediary between her and Morton. Without either of them meeting during the writing of the book, Morton interviewed Colthurst. Colthurst visited Diana with questions. Diana recorded her answers. Tapes were delivered to Morton through further intermediaries. The arrangement was complex because Diana understood the specific understanding of someone who had spent 10 years learning how the institution operated. Any direct contact between her and a journalist would be detected and managed before it could produce the thing she was trying to produce. The thing she was trying to produce was a record, the full specific first-person record of what her marriage had actually been, told in her own voice with her own words, put into a form that the institution could not suppress before the public had received it. She understood the timing. She understood that the book needed to come out in a specific context. The context needed to be one in which the public was already questioning the official account. She needed to have enough public standing at the moment of publication that her account would be received as credible. She had spent years building that standing. The standing was real. The book was the first use of it as a tactical resource rather than simply a public warmth. The palace was not prepared for this. Various accounts from palace insiders at the time describe an institution that found the Morton's existence and content genuinely shocking, not because the facts it described were unknown inside the institution, but because they had been known inside the institution and had been managed there, and the assumption had been apparently that they would stay managed. The assumption was that Diana's compliance with the management could be relied upon indefinitely. The assumption was wrong. Morton's book made public the central facts of the marriage. The bulimia, the self-harm, the isolation, the parallel relationship with Camilla, Diana's knowledge of the parallel relationship, the specific ways the palace had responded to her distress. It was not framed as an attack. Framing was careful, specific, grounded in the kind of detail that is difficult to dispute because it comes from the inside of the situation, rather than from external observation. The palace denied that Diana had cooperated with the book. Diana denied it too. Denial was false in both cases, and the falsity was known to the people making the denial. The specific culture of palace communications had produced a specific tolerance for denials that were understood by everyone involved to be false, because the alternative, acknowledging the truth, produced consequences that the institution was not prepared to manage. Consequences of the denial ran alongside the consequences of the book. The public had received Diana's account. Account was credible because the detail in it was the detail of someone who had been inside the situation. Specific texture of the domestic life at Kensington Palace, the specific quality of the difficulties in the marriage, Specific ways Diana's distress had been managed and ignored. These were not the things that could be fabricated by someone outside looking in. Public knew this without being able to articulate it, and the public response to the Morton book was not primarily skepticism. The specific response of people who had suspected something and had just been told what the something was. 6 months later, in December of 1992, the transcript of a telephone conversation was leaked to the press. Conversation had been recorded in December of 1989, 3 years earlier, by an amateur radio enthusiast who had intercepted it on a scanner. The conversation was between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, intimate in a way that made the relationship between them definitively public, contained language that made the intimacy specific and undeniable. The transcript ran in the press in late 1992, initially in Australia, then in the United Kingdom. The conversation became known as the Camillagate tape. Not the first leaked conversation from the Wales marriage, a tape of a conversation between Diana and a friend named James Gilby had been published earlier in the year. But the Camillagate tape was the one that mattered most in terms of its consequences for the public understanding of the marriage had been. The conversation contained a passage in which Charles expressed the wish to be reincarnated as Camilla's tampon. Passage was quoted widely and produced a specific kind of public humiliation for him that the palace's communications operation was not equipped to manage. There is no crisis management protocol for this kind of material. There is only the waiting for time to do what time does to uncomfortable things, which is make them slightly less immediate without making them untrue. In November of 1993, Charles gave an authorized biography to Jonathan Dimbleby. The biography was based on interviews conducted over 2 years and on access to Charles's private journals. It was published in 1994 to coincide with the documentary that accompanied it. In the documentary, Charles confirmed his relationship with Camilla for the first time in public terms. He said that he had been faithful to Diana until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. Phrase irretrievably broken down was precise in a way that the public noted, because it did not say when it had broken down, or what had caused it to break down, or what the relationship with Camilla had been before the down and during it. The staff who were around Charles at the time the Dimbleby book was being prepared describe a man who understood that the confirmation of the Camilla relationship was going to cost him public standing, and who calculated, on the advice of people around him, managed confirmation was less damaging than continued denial. The calculation was rational. Denial was no longer viable given what was in the public record. Managing the confirmation meant framing it in terms that minimized the damage, rather than refusing to acknowledge facts that had become undeniable. Diana's response to the Dimbleby documentary was public, visible, carefully timed. On the same evening the documentary aired, she attended a gala at the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park. She wore a short black dress that has since become one of the most famous garments in 20th century fashion. She arrived without Charles, without the formal machinery of a royal appearance, and she was photographed by every camera present. Photographs ran on every front page the following morning. The visual story they told was of a woman who was not diminished, not retreating, not managing her public presentation with the institutional caution the palace would have preferred. She was present. She looked like someone who had arrived precisely at the moment she intended to arrive. Staff who worked with her that year described the preparation for the Serpentine evening as deliberate in ways that went beyond the usual work of royal public presentation. Diana had people around her by this point who were loyal to her personally rather than to the institution. Personal stylist, her protection officers, the small inner circle of advisors and friends who had formed around her as the marriage deteriorated. People were not palace employees in the conventional sense. They were people she had chosen, and their loyalty was to her. Preparation was not tactical in the way that a political campaign is tactical. Diana was not running a campaign. She was doing something that requires a different word, building a position from which she could speak, accumulating the public standing that would allow her testimony, when she gave it, to be received as the testimony of someone credible and present and specific, rather than as the testimony of a disappointed wife making retrospective claims against a more powerful institution. The work of building that position had been going on for years by this point. The hospital visits, AIDS handshakes in 1987, when she shook hands ungloved with an AIDS patient in a London hospital, at a time when the public understanding of the disease was still largely governed by fear and misinformation. and the photograph of that handshake ran everywhere and changed. According to multiple accounts from people working in AIDS charities at the time, specific quality of public feeling about the disease and the people who had it, the landmine campaigns, work with the homeless charity Centrepoint, the visits to children in hospitals and hospices that she made without camera teams quietly, became known only because the staff and volunteers at those institutions described them afterward, had a different quality from her public engagements, precisely because they were not designed for cameras, and the people who received her warmth, people who had no reason to doubt its authenticity. All of this built a specific and durable public relationship that was genuinely unusual in the history of the British royal family. Relationship in which large numbers of people felt a personal connection to a royal figure that was not mediated by formal ceremony or institutional occasion but was based on something that felt to the people who felt it, like a direct and real human contact. Institutions' management of Diana had assumed throughout that this relationship was an asset it could deploy. Favorable public presence that served the monarchy's interests. What the management had not fully calculated was that the relationship could also employed by Diana, that the specific loyalty it created ran to her person rather than to the institution she represented, that when the interests of the person and the interests of the institution diverged, the loyalty would go with the person. Diverged fully in November of 1995, when Diana gave a 45-minute interview to Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program. The interview was conducted in secret at Kensington Palace. The palace did not know about it until after it had been recorded. Queen did not know about it until the week before it aired, when Diana's private secretary sent notification to the palace that the interview existed and would be broadcast. 23 million people in the United Kingdom watched the broadcast on November 20, 1995. It was the most watched television program of the year. More people watched it than had watched the wedding 14 years earlier. Interview contained the sentence that became the defining phrase of the Wales marriage for all subsequent public understanding of it. Diana said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The sentence was not improvised. Accounts of people who were around Diana in the period of preparation for the interview are consistent in describing someone who knew exactly what she was going to say and had thought carefully about how she was going to say it. The sentence is careful in its specific construction. Acknowledges the 3-person structure of the marriage without naming Camilla directly. It describes the 3-person structure as crowded. Is a word that carries emotional content without being inflammatory. Places the observation in the past tense in a way that positions the marriage as something already concluded rather than something currently tested. The sentence does everything it needs to do in the fewest possible words. Staff who watched the broadcast at Kensington Palace described the specific quality of Diana in the days before and after it. Composure that came from preparation. The composure was real, but it was also the composure of someone who understands they are about to do something irreversible and has made their peace with the irreversibility. After something that several people describe in similar terms. Quality of having set down a weight. Not happiness exactly, but the specific lightness of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally put it down. The institutional response to the Panorama interview was swift and managed in the way that the palace managed everything it understood as a crisis. The Queen wrote to Charles and to Diana separately in December of 1995. The letters were brief. It said that an early divorce was in the best interests of all parties. The language of the letters, which has been described by people familiar with their contents, was the language of institutional decision-making, rather than the language of a parent writing to a child about the end of that child's marriage. The formal divorce proceedings began in early 1996. Divorce was finalized in August of 1996. Diana was stripped of her HRH title, decision that she found painful in the specific way that a woman who had spent 15 years being told the title was not yet hers to use, and was told it would not be hers to keep found painful. The stripping of the title was the institution's final message about where its interests lay, and whose sacrifice it was prepared to require. The staff who were with Diana in the period between the divorce and her death in August of 1997 describe a woman who was, in various respects, freer than she had been at any point in the marriage, and also more exposed in ways that she not fully anticipated. Free from the institutional constraints that had structured her daily life for 15 years. free to live at Kensington Palace, which had been formally assigned to her in the divorced settlement, on her own terms with her own staff, out the dual management system that a shared royal household requires. Free to form relationships and friendships, and to pursue the public work that had become the primary meaning of her life without constant negotiation. Palace apparatus that had always treated her public standing as an institutional asset rather than as her own. Exposure was financial and structural and personal. She was no longer formally protected by the palace machinery. The protection it had provided, in the form of press management and security resources, and the institutional authority that came with being the Princess of Wales, no longer available to her in the same form. She had her own protection officers. She had her own small household. She had the enormous public standing she had built, which was real, and which no one could manage away from her. But she was also, first time in 15 years, genuinely alone within the institution in the sense that mattered. Paul Burrell described the final year of her life as the most purposeful period he had witnessed in his 10 years in her household. She had, he said, clarity about what she wanted to do and what she wanted her life to be that had not always been visible during the years of the marriage. She was working on the landmine campaign with a seriousness that went beyond charity patronage. She was building what Burrell described as a platform, formal presence from which she could continue to engage with the causes she cared about after the formal dissolution of her royal role. She had also written a letter that Paul Burrell later described as the most important document he had received from her. The letter was written in the autumn of 1996, shortly after the divorce was finalized. In it, she described her current situation as the most dangerous phase of her life. She wrote that she believed someone was planning an accident involving her car. She wrote about brake failure. She wrote about a serious head injury. Did not name the person she believed was behind the plan. The letter has been quoted, described, disputed, subjected to various interpretive frameworks since Burrell made it public years after her death. What its existence establishes, whatever interpretation one places on its specific claims, is that Diana, in the autumn of 1996, was a woman who understood herself to be in a precarious position and who was keeping a record of that understanding. She died in the Pont de l'Alma underpass in Paris on August 31, 1997. The morning after her death, staff at Kensington Palace arrived to find the gates already covered in flowers, not a few dozen, hundreds, growing by the hour, laid by people who had come through the night and through the early morning to leave something at the gate of the house where Diana had lived. Flowers kept coming for days and then for weeks. The staff moved through them to reach the palace. The scale of the response was unlike anything in living memory. A housekeeper who had worked at Kensington Palace for 9 years said later that the specific quality of the grief outside the gates was different from anything she had seen in connection with the royal family. She described it as personal. The people who came to leave flowers were not people who had known Diana or had any formal connection to her. They were people who had watched her on television and had felt, across the years of watching, that they understood something about who she was, were grieving someone they had received as real. Inside the palace, staff managed the transition with the efficiency that royal service required. The personal effects were catalogued. Formal arrangements were put in motion. Burrell, who had been with Diana when she left for Paris and who received the news of her death in the early hours of the morning, described the hours that followed in terms that were specific about the gap between what the institution required in hours, which was management, efficiency, the smooth execution of the protocols for the death of a senior royal, and what the people inside the household actually felt, which was grief. Specific grief of people who had worked for someone and known her in the close way that domestic service produces, and who had watched her try to survive something very difficult for a very long time. The years since her death have been, in their own way, continuation of the story that the marriage began. The institution has managed Diana's memory with the same skill it applied to managing her life. Specific dimensions of her legacy that are most comfortable for the institution: the charitable work, the connection to ordinary people, mother who loved her sons without qualification, the woman whose presence changed the way royalty was experienced in public. These are the dimensions the institution has worked to keep central. The dimensions that are less comfortable: specific history of the marriage and what it contained, the account she gave in her own voice of what the institution had done to her, question of what the management structure of the palace was doing during the years, when her distress was visible and unaddressed. These are the dimensions the management has worked, with some success, to keep from becoming the dominant public memory. The success has been partial. Diana's account of her marriage, delivered in her own voice to 23 million people who received it as credible. Not the kind of account that can be unmade. It exists in the public record. The Panorama interview is available. The Morton recordings were released after her death are available. The testimony of the staff who have spoken, in various forms and with various degrees of completeness across the 30 years since her death, is available to anyone who looks for it. Palace understands this and has adapted its management to it. The management does not now attempt to deny what Diana said, manages the context in which what she said is received, working to ensure that what she said is understood as one account among several possible accounts rather than as the definitive account it was when she gave it. This is sophisticated management, and it has had some effect. The effect is incomplete in a way that the management cannot fully address, because the specific quality of Diana's account, specificity of its detail, the directness of its expression, the visible cost that giving it imposed on her, is the quality that makes it durable. Charles became king in September of 2022, on the death of his mother. Camilla Parker Bowles, who had married him in April of 25, stood beside him at the coronation in May of 2023. The coronation was watched globally. The crowds were large. Ceremony was performed with the precision that such ceremonies require. Image of Camilla crowned was the image the institution had been working toward since 1997. Staff who were present at the coronation, many of them in roles that had been occupied by different people in 1981, formed their functions with the efficiency that royal service requires. The work was real. The occasion was real. The monarchy continues, has continued through the periods that various people at various points believed would be its last. What also continues is the record. Phone call Diana heard in a room in Kensington Palace sometime in 1982 or 83. 13 years of silence in which she carried the knowledge of what she had heard. The Morton book and the audio tapes it was based on. Bashir interview, and the 23 million people who watched it. Testimony of the staff who were present in the corridors and the dining rooms and the upstairs rooms of the Wales household across 15 years. A marriage that the institution needed to look like something it was not. The management has been working on that record for 30 years. Record persists. There is a particular thing that happens to the testimony of domestic staff when it concerns the private lives of the powerful. It is received, when it is received at all, through a specific filter. The filter is the assumption that service produces partisanship. People who worked closely with someone and have affection for that person are not reliable witnesses to that person's reality. Filter is not entirely unreasonable. Service does produce partiality, but the filter applied consistently has the effect of excluding from the historical record precisely the people who were most often present, who saw the most, who had the least institutional incentive to construct a flattering narrative, and whose accounts are therefore, in various respects, more reliable than the accounts of people at greater distance. The staff who worked in the Wales household across the years of the marriage were not, for the most part, people with an agenda. They were people who had chosen a form of work that placed them inside private lives and had agreed to keep, they saw private. When some of them in the years after Diana's death began speaking in various forms, things they said were consistent with each other, and with the account Diana had given herself. Consistency is significant because the accounts were given by different people, in different contexts at different times. Consistency under those conditions is a reasonable indicator of accuracy. Specific details of what they described are the specific details that the institutional account had worked hardest to keep in the background. Quality of the household in its daily private life. The schedules that maintain two separate existences within a formerly shared one. Fights and the silences that were worse than the fights. The mental health struggles that were witnessed and not addressed. Specific ways Diana tried and the specific ways those attempts were not received. The emotional reality of a household in which one person had brought into the marriage a prior commitment that was not acknowledged and that shaped everything. What the staff saw across the full 15 years of the marriage was the cost of institutional silence. Specific cost to a specific person of being inside an institution that had decided at every level the surface mattered more than the truth, and that the resources of the institution would be deployed in the service of the surface rather than service of the person the surface was supposed to represent. Diana eventually found a way to use the surface herself. She learned the specific skill of the institution, the management of appearances, and she applied it with an effectiveness that the institution had not anticipated and could not fully counter. The sheer interview was the culmination of that learning. It was a management operation of a specific kind. She managed the disclosure of truth rather than the concealment of it, and she did it in a way that put the truth in front of the public before the institution could manage the public's access to it. The sentence about 3 people in a marriage was heard by 23 million people at the same moment. The institution could not manage 23 million people's reception of a sentence they had just heard. It is the specific victory of the moment. Not just that it was said, but that it was said in a form that could not be managed before it was received. The people who worked for her and who have spoken across the 30 years since her death carry in their accounts a consistent thread. Describe a woman who was very far from perfect, who was complicated and sometimes difficult, and who had her own capacities for the kind of management she criticized in the institution. She was not a saint. She was a human being who had grown up inside deprivation of a specific kind, who had married into a situation she had been inadequately prepared for, who had survived 15 years of that situation by developing capacities the institution had not thought to account for, who had eventually found a way to say what she knew in her own voice to an audience that received it as true. Receiving of it as true is what the institution has spent 30 years managing. The management has had success. Large numbers of people who were not born when the marriage happened have a version of its history that has been shaped by the 30 years of post-Diana institutional narrative as much as by Diana's own account. Narrative is not dishonest in any simple sense. Acknowledges the difficulties of the marriage. It acknowledges Diana's suffering, incorporates her into the institutional story in a way that honors certain dimensions of her legacy while managing the dimensions that challenge institution's account of itself. The dimensions the management has worked hardest on are the ones this account has attempted to describe. Phone call and what it meant, the 13 years of silence and what they cost. Specific ways the palace knew about Diana's distress and chose management over care, the Highgrove visits and what the staff witnessed there, bracelet and what it said about the marriage before it had formally begun, fights and the salad dressing and the table overturned in the upper rooms of the palace while the formal household went about its business below, letter in the autumn of 1996 and what it said about the most dangerous phase. These are the things that the institution would prefer were not the central public memory of the Wales marriage, and they are also given everything. Things that are most clearly documented and most consistently described by the people who were present. Persist because Diana made them persist, not only through the Bashir interview, though that was the most visible act, through the Morton recordings, through the specific act of making those recordings alone in a room and trusting them to a chain of people who were palace employees and who were loyal to her rather than to the institution, through the years of building the public standing that made her testimony credible when she gave it, through the specific and sustained work of making herself unforgettable to the people she met in hospitals and hospices and at the margins of the public world that the institution preferred to keep formal and managed. She made herself unforgettable because she understood, somewhere in the years of carrying her knowledge, that the institution's primary tool for managing inconvenient truths was forgetting. A person who knew the truth could be made to seem unreliable, unstable, dramatic. The truth could be managed into the background. A person who knew the truth was loved by millions of people who would receive that person's account as credible. Truth was considerably harder to manage. She made herself loved in the specific way that a person who understood deprivation makes themselves, by giving freely what she had most needed and not received, the physical warmth, the direct attention, willingness to be present with people in their suffering, without the careful formal distance that the institution's approach to public engagement required. This was not a calculated performance, or not only that, it was genuine. Genuineness is visible in every account of every person she touched in those years. Consistent across very different people in very different contexts. She gave what she gave because she knew from the inside what its absence felt. The institution built her public standing and then found it could not control it. This is the specific irony of the management operation. Public presentation of Diana required her to be warm and present and relatable in ways that other senior royals were not. 'Cause the institution needed her in those years to soften the public's perception of a monarchy that had been criticized for its distance and its formality. The warming worked. The public responded to her in exactly the way the institution needed, and the same quality that made the warming work, specific authentic warmth of a person who had something real to give, also the quality that made the public's relationship with her personal, rather than institutional. Personal loyalty does not transfer when the person is removed. When the institution tried to manage Diana's relationship with the public relationship stayed with Diana. The institution manages the present. The record holds the past. Diana kept records in two senses. She kept the audio tapes that became the Morton book. She kept the letter to Burrell about the most dangerous phase. She kept the specific memory of every detail of what she had lived and was eventually willing to put that memory into a form that could not be unmade. Records persist because the institution has not been able to suppress them. The institution has not been able to suppress them because the people who received them, public who watched Panorama and read the Morton book and followed the accounts of staff who spoke in the years after her death, received them as true and have carried the receiving as true into the subsequent decades. William was 15 when his mother died. Harry was 12. Specific ages have been noted in various accounts as significant because they describe two boys at different points in the process of understanding what they were living inside. William old enough to have formed a conscious understanding of significant portions of the marriage, private reality. Harry old enough to have absorbed the emotional texture of the household without yet having the analytical framework to organize. He had absorbed. Both of them inherited what Diana knew, not in the same form she knew it, not with the same completeness, in the form that children inherit from parents, through the atmosphere of the household, through the specific quality of a mother's private moods that they experienced without being able to fully contextualize. The things that were said and not said in the rooms they grew up in. What Harry later wrote in his memoir, Spare, consistent in its understanding of how the institution operates with Diana's own account of how it operates. The techniques are the same. Priorities are the same. The specific damage they produce in the individuals inside them is recognizable from one generation to the next. Harry learned it twice, first as a child absorbing his mother's reality, and then as an adult inside the same institution watching the same technique applied to his own wife. The learning produced a book, which is a different form of the same thing Diana produced in the Bashir interview, first-person account of what the institution does to the people inside it, delivered in a public form that the institution cannot manage before the public receives it. Institution has spent the years since managing Harry's account in the same way it managed Diana's. The management has had some success. Public reception of Spare was more divided than the public reception of Panorama. Institutional narrative had had 25 years to develop its tools since 1995. Tools are more sophisticated than they were. The management is more experienced. But the account is in the record. Diana's account is in the record, and records persist in ways that management cannot fully control. The brothers arrived, through their different experiences and different trajectories, at different relationships to the truth of their family's history. William has maintained the silence the institution requires. Harry has not. What they share is the inheritance, truth of what was inside the Wales marriage, received in different forms and to different degrees, still working itself out in both of them, in ways that the public can see but not fully interpret. Staff who are still alive and who worked in the Wales household across the 15 years of the marriage have varying degrees of willingness to speak. Some of them have spoken, in various forms in the 30 years since Diana's death. Some of them have not, constrained by the agreements they signed and the fears that remain real even at this distance from the events. Some of them have died, that they knew has gone with them. The accounts that have emerged, taken together, describe a marriage that was, from its structural center outward, built on a condition that made it impossible for Diana to be what the institution needed her to be, and what needed to be for herself at the same time. The condition was the prior commitment Charles carried into the marriage and maintained through it. Condition produced the silence, and the silence produced the costs, and the costs produced the specific human story that the institution has been managing ever since. The management continues. The record holds. What Diana said in that 45-minute broadcast in her own voice to the largest television audience in the United Kingdom that year is not something that can be unsaid. The word crowded used about her own marriage in the specific context of an interview that was watched by 23 million people who had spent 14 years forming their view of the speaker as a credible witness, is not a word the institution has been able to manage out of the public memory. She spent 15 years preparing to say it. She said it with the care of someone who had thought about exactly how to say it for a very long time. Institution has spent 30 years since managing the consequences of her saying it. Both operations have been conducted with skill. Institution's operation has been more sustained and has had more resources. Diana's operation was conducted by a single person, largely alone, from inside an institution that was working against her. The comparison suggests something about what is required to say a true thing about power. From inside a system that has every interest in keeping the true thing unsaid, it requires patience. Requires the willingness to carry knowledge in silence for longer than feels bearable. It requires the careful construction of the conditions under which the saying will be received as credible. It requires the specific kind of courage that is not dramatic or visible from the outside, but that expresses itself in the daily maintenance of purpose across years of pressure designed to erode it. Diana had all of these things. She had them not because she was naturally suited to the kind of long strategic patience her situation required, because the specific childhood she had survived, and the specific marriage she had entered, had produced, in the process of surviving them, exact capacities the situation demanded. The loneliness of Park House after her mother left had taught her to watch people with precision. Custody battle and its outcome had taught her the specific understanding of institutional power that would eventually allow her to use the institution's tools against it. The marriage itself, with its 15 years of managed silence and its visible costs, had been the preparation for the moment when the managing of silence gave way to the managed disclosure of truth. She left behind a record. Record includes the audio tapes, the Bashir interview, the Morton book, the specific testimony of the people who knew her. Record includes the letter to Paul Burrell, written in the autumn of 1996, about the most dangerous phase. Record includes the photographs, thousands of them, that show in ways words cannot always show the specific quality of her presence in the world. Crouching down to talk to children, the holding of hands with people in hospital, warmth that was not performed and could not have been performed at such consistent scale over such a long period. Record includes the memory of 23 million people who watched her speak and received what they heard as true. Institution manages the present. The record holds the past. She understood this. Understanding shaped the 15 years of silence and the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of panorama that ended them. Management that has been directed at her memory since her death has had to reckon with the specific durability of an account given by someone who spent 15 years making themselves impossible to disbelieve. The reckoning continues. If you have watched this story all the way through, thank you for being here. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet done so, and press the notification bell, cause the stories we cover here are the ones that have been managed carefully for a very long time. We intend to keep looking at what the management has kept in the background. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We read every one of them. This story has layers we have not yet fully told, and we will be returning to it. Is a particular way that people who knew Charles before his marriage describe the man they knew. The description is consistent enough across different sources to be worth taking seriously. They describe a man who was not comfortable. In the way that ordinary shyness produces discomfort, the simple anxiety of a person who does not know how to occupy social space. It was a more specific discomfort than that. The discomfort of someone who has been told their entire life that they are significant without ever being given the tools to know what significance actually means for a person who has to live inside it. He was born in November of 1948, the first child of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, born into a situation that had been constructed over centuries to be precisely what it was, the continuation of a dynasty, the production of an heir. Parents were not cold people in any simple sense. His father Philip, an energetic and difficult man who found emotional expression through action, rather than through the forms of intimate communication that a young child requires. His mother was a woman whose public duties were already, before Charles was born, consuming the vast majority of her time and attention, and whose relationship to the public role of monarchy had been shaped by a tradition that did not encourage the conflation of the public role with personal expressiveness. Charles did not grow up in the kind of household that produced ease with intimacy. is documented across multiple accounts by people who knew him at various stages of his childhood, and who describe consistently boy who was sensitive in ways his environment was not equipped to accommodate, sensitive to atmosphere, sensitive to criticism, sensitive to the specific quality of his father's impatience, which was real and was frequently directed at a son who was not. Philip's formative experience, the kind of boy that Philip's own formative experience had led him to respect. Gordonstoun, school in the northeast of Scotland, where Philip had been a pupil, and where Charles was sent following the model of his father's education, an environment of considerable physical hardship and social difficulty for a boy with Charles's temperament. The accounts of his time there, including his own, describe a period of genuine unhappiness. He was bullied in the specific ways that boarding schools of that era, governed by a culture that treated sensitivity as weakness, produced bullying. He found the school's emphasis on physical robustness and communal exposure difficult in ways that shaped, according to his own later accounts, his understanding of what he needed that the public world he had been born into was unlikely to provide. What he needed, the consistent account of people who knew him in those years, and in the decades that followed, was a particular kind of emotional companionship, kind that does not require performance, that does not ask for the managed presentation that his public role required constantly, allows for the specific admission of uncertainty and doubt and vulnerability that the heir to the British throne was not permitted to make in public and found himself unable to make even in private with most of the people around him. Lord Mountbatten provided something of what he needed. Mountbatten's murder in August of 1979, killed by an IRA bomb on his fishing boat off the coast of Ireland, is a loss that the people around Charles at the time described as devastating in a way that his public composure did not show. Batten had been the person to whom Charles had been able to speak with relative honesty about the interior of his life. The letters between them, portions of which have been quoted in various accounts, show a relationship of genuine warmth in which Charles was allowed a frankness about his emotional state that the formal structure of the rest of his world did not accommodate. Batten's death meant the loss of the primary relationship in which Charles's emotional reality had been allowed to exist. It also coincided, in the months that followed, with the intensification of the institutional pressure on Charles to marry. He was 31. Pressure had been building for years. It became, after Mountbatten's death, more urgent and less resistible. Specific relationship Charles had with Camilla Parker Bowles, married by then to Andrew Parker Bowles for 6 years, and the mother of 2 children, had been resumed in a form that people around both of them understood without naming. The resumption had begun by various accounts, period following Mountbatten's death, when Charles sought her company for the specific comfort that her company had always provided, and that no one else in his world was equipped to provide in the same way. Camilla Parker Bowles is, in the accounts that have emerged over the years, more complicated figure than the public narrative around the Wales marriage has typically allowed for. Narrative gave her a role, and the role was defined entirely in relation to Diana, the other woman, the presence that occupied the marriage, person named in the phrase about 3 people in the marriage. The role is accurate in the factual sense. Camilla was the other woman. Presence did occupy the marriage. She was the third person. But the human reality of her position is more complicated than the role allows for. Staff and observers who knew her in the years before and during the Wales marriage describe someone who was not simply an architectural feature of Charles's emotional life, but a full person who had her own complicated relationship to the situation she was in. Was born in 1947, the daughter of Major Bruce Shand, decorated veteran of the Second World War and a prominent figure in the social world of upper-class England. She grew up in Sussex, educated in ways that produced a woman of genuine warmth and considerable social intelligence, and she arrived in London in the late 1960s as a young woman of the kind that a specific social world of that era and class produced. Confident without being aggressive, warm without being sentimental, with a sense of humour that was dry and self-aware, and that was, by all accounts, quality that Charles had responded to most strongly when they first met. The first meeting happened in 1970. Polo match in Windsor Great Park. Charles was 21 and had just been invested as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle the previous year. Investiture had been a large public ceremony at which his mother had placed the coronet on his head, and he had knelt before her and pledged his service to the crown and the country, and the ceremony had been watched by millions and had placed on him at 20 full weight of public expectation in its most formal form. Camilla, by accounts of people who were there at the first meeting, introduced herself with a reference to the fact that her great-grandmother Alice Keppel had been the long-term mistress of King Edward VII, Charles's great-great-grandfather. She said in some versions of the account words to the effect that their ancestors had something in common, and she thought they might find the same to be true. Boldness of the opening was itself part of what worked. Charles encountered in most of his social interactions quality of slightly subdued attention that his position produced in people who were aware of his position and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Camilla did not adjust. She was direct, she was funny, she was interested in him without being deferential about it. And the combination, in a young man who had spent his life in an environment that required everyone around him to maintain a certain formal distance, startling and immediately compelling. They spent time together across the following year. Relationship that developed was described by people who observed it at the time as something both of them found genuinely sustaining. She was the kind of company he had not had before, someone who could sit with him and talk about things that interested him without the conversation being shaped by the formal requirements of his role, someone who made him feel, specific and uncommon way that the right person provides this feeling. He could be what he actually was rather than what the situation required him to be. Institutional position on Camilla as a candidate for marriage was not favorable. The reasons given at the time, and repeated in various accounts, included her earlier relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles, which the palace understood as a significant prior romantic history, in a context that required the absence of significant prior history. They included questions about whether she met the specific criteria for suitability in a formal, institutional sense, and they included probably most significantly the specific pressure from the older generation of royals and their advisors who had strong views about what the future wife of the Prince of Wales was required to bring to the role. Charles joined the Royal Navy in 1971. He left for naval duties overseas. Relationship with Camilla could not survive the distance in the specific institutional context in which it existed. Accounts suggest Charles failed to make the proposal that might have changed the trajectory, whether because he was uncertain, because he was constrained by the institutional pressure, because the specific combination of his emotional nature and his circumstance made decisive action of that kind difficult. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in July of 1973, while Charles was serving in the Caribbean. Accounts of Charles's reaction to the news are consistent in describing it as a significant blow. He wrote about it in letters quoted in various biographies. He described it as particularly cruel that something which had been genuinely sustaining mutual had been ended by circumstances rather than by the choice of the people inside it. Andrew Parker Bowles was a man who had his own complicated emotional history, including a period of involvement with Princess Anne before his marriage to Camilla. The Parker Bowles marriage was not, accounts that have emerged over the years, a marriage of simple contentment. Parker Bowles had his own relationships outside the marriage. Marriage had a quality, described by people who knew them as a couple, practical arrangement between two adults who were fond of each other in the specific way of people who have known each other for years and have accommodated each other's limitations. Into this arrangement, the resumption of the relationship with Charles after Mountbatten's death was not specific emotional reality of what Camilla's marriage was. The same kind of disruption it would have been in a marriage of simpler commitment does not make it morally uncomplicated. It does mean that the picture is more complicated than the public narrative has typically allowed. Time Charles married Diana in 1981, the relationship with Camilla had been resumed and had a character that the staff around Charles understood in various degrees of completeness to be ongoing. This is the condition that Diana stepped into. Condition was not visible to her in its full form at the time of the engagement. The bracelet was a signal she read correctly. Phone call was the confirmation, but the full structure of what she had entered was not something she had access to in the weeks before the wedding, and the institution that had arranged the marriage had no interest in providing her with access to it. Question of whether Charles's handling of the situation reflected a specific failure of personal character, or the failure of an institutional system that had constructed for him an arrangement he did not have the tools to manage honestly has been debated across the decades since. People who knew him best, the ones whose accounts are most specific and most consistent, tend toward a description of both operating simultaneously. They describe a man who had genuine emotional limitations that his upbringing had produced and that his situation had never required him to overcome. They describe an institution that provided no mechanism for him to address those limitations honestly and considerable machinery for managing their consequences in ways that kept the surface intact at the cost of the people inside. Specific sequence of events between the November 1980 shooting weekend at Althorpe and the announcement of the engagement in February of 1981 has been documented in considerable detail by various accounts over the years. What emerges from the detail is not the simple fairy tale progression that the public presentation constructed, but something more complicated, more institutional, and in various respects more uncomfortable. The shooting weekend at Althorpe was not a chance encounter. Diana had been present at the edges of the Spencer-Wales relationship for 3 years, since her older sister Sarah's brief involvement with Charles in 1977. Spencer's connection to the royal family was old and specific. The family's connection to Sandringham, through the house they had rented on the date, the Queen Mother's connection to Diana's maternal grandmother Lady Fermoy, general web of aristocratic interconnection that placed the Spencer girls at the right social altitude to be considered for the role that the institution needed filled. Diana had been noticed before the November weekend. There had been at least one earlier meeting, Young Farmers event in 1978, though neither principal seems to have registered it particularly. Meeting at Althorpe was different because by November of 1980, the institutional pressure on Charles to produce a decision had reached a pitch that was hard to ignore, and the institutional apparatus was actively directing his attention toward candidates who met the requirements. Diana met those requirements. She was 19 and had no significant romantic history. She was from a family with the right connections. Spencer looks fair and tall, and carrying herself with the ease of someone who had grown up in large houses and at public occasions and not overwhelmed by the formality of royal proximity. She was, by the accounts of people who were present at Althorpe that weekend, warm and engaging and very good at giving her attention to the person she was speaking to in a way that he found compelling. She also ran after him across a field to speak to him about Mountbatten. This is described in several accounts of the first substantive meeting. She found him alone at the edge of the shooting party and told him she felt for what he must have been going through in the year since Mountbatten's death, and that she thought he had been incredibly sad and that it must have been very lonely. Direct emotional accuracy of the observation was the thing that landed, not the condolence which he had received from hundreds of people, the specific identification of the loneliness as the operative fact of the grief. Charles began calling her. Calls happened across the autumn and winter, alongside the occasional meeting at country house weekends. Courtship was not conducted with the sustained closeness that would have allowed either of them to form a full picture of the other. They were not alone together enough. The institution's mechanisms for managing the courtship of the heir to the throne did not leave a great deal of room for the kind of time together that produces a real understanding of a person's interior. A woman who was part of the social circle in which the courtship happened, and who later described it in a memoir that covered the period, said that Diana's feelings for Charles at this stage were genuine and simple, in a way that Charles's feelings for her were not. She was in love with him in the specific way of a young woman who had found Prince's attentiveness, and the possibility the attention seemed to contain, something she had been looking for without having been fully conscious of looking for it. Charles's feelings were more complicated. Various accounts from people who were around him at the time describe a man who was drawn to Diana, found her youth and her warmth and her directness genuinely appealing, who was aware that the institutional requirements and the accumulating pressure from his parents' generation of advisors were all directing him toward exactly this kind of decision, and toward this candidate specifically, who made the decision in the specific way that a man who has been told his entire life what he is required to do and who lacks specific moment of choosing the resources to refuse the requirement makes a decision. Genuine elements of feeling mixed with a compliance with institutional pressure that was not examined honestly, because examining it honestly have required a capacity for self-knowledge that the situation had never required or rewarded. The engagement was announced on February 24, 1981. Couple appeared on the steps of Buckingham Palace for the photographs. Diana wore a blue suit, the color of the sapphire in the engagement ring. She looked radiant in the specific way of someone who is genuinely happy. Charles stood beside her and said the words that were required of him, and was, by the accounts of people who were watching closely, present and slightly separate from the presence in the way of a man who is performing a role that he is committed to, but whose emotional relationship to it is more complicated than the performance shows. The engagement period lasted 5 months. Diana moved into Buckingham Palace at the family's insistence, which meant she was removed from the flat at Colaherne Court, from her friends, from the independent life she had been building, and placed inside an institutional structure that was managing her preparation for the role she was to take. The preparation was logistical rather than emotional or psychological. It covered the formal dimensions of her public life, to where and how to behave and what was expected of her at various kinds of occasions. Did not cover the realities of the marriage she was entering. Nobody told her about Camilla in any form that allowed her to understand what Camilla meant. Nobody prepared her for the specific emotional climate of the household she was joining. Nobody explained to her what the institution would expect of her when the surface of the marriage came under pressure. 5 months of the engagement were, by Diana's own account, and by the accounts of people around her at the time, period in which her initial happiness was progressively undercut by the specific realities that the engagement made visible. Discovering of the bracelet was one of these realities. Another was the specific quality of the emotional distance that Charles maintained even in the weeks immediately before the wedding, a distance that Diana had not been prepared for and that she interpreted, the specific emotional acuity she had developed through her childhood, as the presence of something that had not been disclosed. She lost weight during the engagement period. The photographs chart it. The young woman at the beginning of the engagement and the young woman at the end are visibly different in ways that have been noted by various accounts. The weight loss was partly the beginning of the bulimia, was also partly the physical expression of an anxiety that had nowhere institutional to go. She could not raise her concerns with the palace. She could not raise them with Charles in a way that produced an honest response. She could not raise them with her family, because the family was fully committed to the alliance. The Genguich representant was not prepared to help her find a way out of it, even if a way out had been what she wanted. Night before the wedding, she cried in her room at Clarence House for a long time. The dresser who was with her reported it later. Crying was not performance and was not nervousness in any simple sense. It was the expression of someone who understood, at some level, that they could not fully bring to the surface, that they were about to go through with something that was not what they had believed was. Kensington Palace was built as a residential palace for members of the royal family in the 17th century, expanded and modified across the following 200 years, and by the time Charles and Diana took up residence in the apartments that became their home in the early 1980s, it had the quality of all spaces that have been occupied by the same kind of people for a very long time. Specific weight of accumulated history. The sense that the walls have received more emotional content than they have ever been permitted to play. The Wales apartments were not small, but they were residential in scale rather than ceremonial, which meant they had the quality of a house that someone lived in rather than a palace that performed state functions. Rooms had views over the palace gardens. The garden was private in a way that very little of Diana's life was private. Staff who worked in the household describe a woman who used the garden in the early mornings, and the light was still thin, and the day's management had not yet started. Paul Burrell described the specific geography of Diana's daily life at Kensington Palace in terms that convey the specific texture of her private existence. The kitchen where she ate breakfast alone on many mornings, the small sitting room she had arranged with photographs of the boys and the objects that meant things to her personally, rather than the objects that the palace's formal furnishing requirements would have produced. Bedroom where she recorded the Morton tapes, alone, with the curtains drawn. Household staff at Kensington Palace across the Wales years were a mix of long-serving royal employees, people who had transferred from other royal households and whose primary loyalty ran to the institution and its standards. People Diana had specifically sought out or selected, whose loyalty ran to her. The mix produced a specific internal dynamic. Staff who were institutional in their orientation managed the formal requirements of the household. The staff who were loyal to Diana personally managed the informal requirements of her life. Two groups were not always in conflict, but they were not always in harmony either. Between them was a space Diana inhabited with considerable awareness. Several household staff from this period have described accounts given across the years after Diana's death, the specific quality of her presence in the domestic spaces of the palace. Describes someone who was more at ease in the kitchen and the service areas than in the formal rooms, sat on kitchen counters and talked to the staff who were preparing meals in a way that was unusual for a senior royal, who remembered the names of staff's family members and asked after them in a way that felt genuine because it was genuine. Also described the other dimension, the mornings after difficult nights, when the household could tell from her entry into the kitchen what had happened in the floors above. Specific quality of her face on those mornings, composed, controlled, performing the normalcy of a woman starting her day. Underneath the performance, a specific exhaustion that the long-serving staff learned to read. The protection officers saw more than most. Close protection team that accompanied Diana on her public engagements and her private movements had the specific access to the unmanaged moments her life that the household staff had in domestic spaces but extended beyond them. Ken Waff, who served as Diana's personal protection officer from 1988 to 1993 and who later wrote about his years in the role, described a relationship between principal and protection that had developed into something more openly communicative than the conventional relationship of principal and security officer typically allows. He described Diana as a woman who did not find the constant presence of security comfortable in the abstract, but who had formed with specific officers relationships of genuine trust, partly because those officers were among the few people around her who were not, in any direct sense, accountable to the palace's management structure in a way that made honesty about her situation difficult. They had security clearances, had confidentiality obligations, but their immediate loyalty was to her personal safety, which meant that their relationship to her daily reality was different from the relationship of household staff who were managing the formal requirements of a royal household. What Waff witnessed and described with the care of someone writing about a former principal and conscious of obligations that history imposes on testimony was consistent with the broader picture that emerges from other accounts. Management of two parallel lives within the same formal household, the schedules that kept the principals separate without the separation being acknowledged as separation, the specific communication between Charles and Camilla that protection officers in proximity to both households were aware of, the calls and the correspondence and the occasional visits, managed in ways that required participation from the household staff on both sides, and that produced a shared knowledge among the staff that nobody was required to acknowledge officially. Waff described the Australian tour of 1988 as a turning point in his understanding of the marriage's reality. He was with Diana on that tour. He watched the public response to her in ways that gave him a specific appreciation for the scale of the phenomenon she had become, and he watched, alongside the public's success, the private dynamic between Charles and Diana that produced gaps between public appearances, a quality of interaction that told him the directness that close observation of two people over an extended period provides, that whatever the marriage had been, no longer functioning as a marriage, there were specific moments. Waff described the quality of the conversations between Charles and Diana in private moments on that tour. Quality was the quality of two people who have given up on the ordinary domestic communication of a shared life and are managing varying degrees of success, the maintenance of the formal requirements of a public appearance. He described the preparation for public engagements, the briefings and the transport and the organization process in which the two principals were treated by their respective staffs as distinct operations that were occasionally required to appear in same photograph. This was not unusual in royal touring. The formal separation of principal and consort in terms of their programs and their staff schedules was standard practice in a large tour. What was unusual, Waff's account, and by the accounts of others who accompanied the Wales on overseas tours across the decade, the quality of the few moments when the formal separation gave way to the informality of two people who were nominally a couple sharing the same suite of rooms in a hotel somewhere far from home. The informality in those moments, thin and effortful in ways that the staff observed without being able to address. Highgrove staff's perspective was different from the London staff's perspective, and from the perspective of the touring staff, In some ways it was the most complete, because Highgrove was the space where the marriage's private reality was least managed. Highgrove was Charles's house in a way that Kensington Palace was not, and the staff at Highgrove had been selected on a basis and with a loyalty reflected that reality. A former member of the garden staff at Highgrove gave an account years after Diana's death of the specific rhythms of house across the Wales years. The garden was Charles's project, an extensive transformation of the grounds that he had undertaken with genuine passion, and that consumed considerable amounts of his private time when he was at the house. Garden was also the place where the informal domestic life of the house was most visible. Walks and the conversations, and the relaxed engagement with the outdoors that Charles found restorative. Garden staff saw who walked in the garden with him. They saw the specific quality of ease that the walks produced. They saw over time pattern of who was present when the ease was present, and who was absent from the garden in the periods when the ease was replaced by the managed performance that his public life required. Camilla Parker Bowles walked in that garden, is documented in multiple accounts from multiple sources across different periods. The frequency of her visits, specific occasions on which she was present, the staff's understanding of what her presence represented. These are details that the accounts provide consistently, without requiring any inference that goes beyond what was directly witnessed. She was there. Staff saw her there. The quality of the household changed when she was present and when she was not. What the garden staff observed, what eventually found its way into various accounts given across the years following Diana's death. The specific contrast between the household atmosphere on Camilla's visits and the household atmosphere on the occasions when Diana was at Highgrove. The contrast was not dramatic. It was specific and persistent. Household operated as a different kind of place depending on who was in it. Staff, who were attentive to the emotional texture of the place. The long-serving members, who had been at Highgrove since before the marriage, or since the very beginning of it, knew the difference without having to articulate it. Woman who had served in the household for 4 years described the atmosphere on Diana's visits to Highgrove as tense in a way that required careful management, not hostile, not overtly uncomfortable, but carrying a specific quality of maintained formal correctness that told her something. Being managed. The management was the management of people who had agreed without discussing the agreement to maintain a surface. She did not know at the time what was underneath the surface that required this kind of management. She formed her understanding retrospectively, in the years after the marriage ended and the full picture became available. Eating disorder that Diana developed during the engagement period, and that continued with varying severity through the first decade of the marriage, is described in her own accounts with a specificity that makes clear she understood what she was doing, and why she was doing it. She said in the Morton recordings that the bulimia was a way of asking for help in the only language available to her inside household that had no official mechanism for receiving a request for help. She said it was a response to the specific pain of a situation she could not address directly. A way of exerting control over one small dimension of a life in which she felt she had no control over the dimensions that mattered. Staff who were around her in the years when the bulimia was most severe describe observing signs of it without fully understanding what they were observing at the time. The patterns of the household around meals, the specific ways the domestic routine was sometimes disrupted after Diana had eaten. The weight fluctuations that were visible to the people who dressed her and travelled with her. Exhaustion that came with a physical condition that depletes the body while being maintained in secret, were also the instances that were not secret, the occasions when the distress was acute enough to become visible in ways the staff could not pretend they had not seen. A housekeeper described arriving at a bathroom that had been locked for an unusually long period and finding door was eventually opened, a space that told a story she did not want to interpret. She reported it to her immediate superior in the household. Nothing happened. The nothing was not negligence in any simple sense. The institutional response to a management problem. The management response to a princess in the kind of distress that the palace did not have. Framework for addressing was not to address it, but to ensure it remained contained. Is one of the dimensions of the Wales marriage that various palace insiders, speaking in the years after Diana's death, described with the specific discomfort of people who understand, with the clarity that retrospect provides. They were part of a system that failed someone. Not through active cruelty, through the specific passive cruelty of an institution that had decided, at every level of its hierarchy, its primary obligation was to the surface, rather than to the people maintaining the surface. Mental health professionals Diana eventually sought help from outside the palace structure, described working with a woman who had a complex relationship to receiving care. She was not unaware of her need for professional support. She had sought it out, but the seeking out required a specific kind of discretion that normal care does not require, cause the palace's involvement in her treatment, if it had been arranged through institutional channels, produced management rather than care. The professionals she found outside the institution were people she had selected with the same care she applied to everything else in her life that she wanted kept outside the institution's management. Dr. Michael Colquhoun, her astrologer and a figure who occupied an unusual advisory position in her life during the 1980s, described in an account given years after her death, a woman who was looking for the kind of understanding and guidance that her environment systematically denied her. He was not a clinical professional and was aware of the limitations of what he could offer. What he could offer was outside the institutional structure, and the outside for Diana was where the only honest conversations happened. Self-harm was described by Diana herself in the Morton recordings and in the Bashir interview. She described it with the directness of someone who had thought carefully about whether to disclose it, and had decided that the disclosure served a purpose larger than the privacy she might otherwise have protected. She described it as something she had done to herself in moments of extreme distress, as a way of turning the internal pain into something external and visible. She said she did it because the external injury produced a reaction from Charles, a brief concern, a temporary attention. The internal distress did not produce. This detail, one of the most specific in her own account of the marriage reality, detail that the management narrative has found most difficult to incorporate. Narrative that was constructed around Charles's rehabilitation and around the eventual public acceptance of his relationship with Camilla, required a version of the marriage in which the damage was mutual and the responsibility was distributed. Specific detail of self-harm as a response to being unable to produce concern in any other way is not consistent with a distributed responsibility account. It is consistent with Diana's account of the marriage's structural reality. Woman inside an institution with no mechanism for honest communication about her distress, lacking one of the very few forms of communication available to her, visible evidence of pain that could not be ignored when every other form of communication had been ignored or managed. To understand fully what the staff observed in the Wales household in the years between the early 1980s and the collapse of the marriage's surface in 1992, it is necessary to understand the parallel structure that had developed. Two lives maintained within one formal household, with their own rhythms and their own staff and their own logistical requirements, had to periodically coincide for the purposes of the public presentation, without their underlying separation being visible. Management of this structure was the daily work of a significant number of people, not a single coordinator, not a formal management team with a brief for managing the parallel lives of the Princess and Prince of Wales. Rather, diffuse management that institutions produce when a problem that cannot be officially acknowledged requires an unofficial solution. Individuals at various levels of the household structure making the individual decisions that maintain the surface, each of them contributing to a collective management operation that no one of them was responsible for designing, but that all of them were participating in. The schedules were the most visible dimension of this. Published engagements diary of the Prince and Princess of Wales showed a couple whose joint appearances were frequent and whose domestic life, peered from the outside, shared. The private schedule, the one maintained by the respective private secretaries and protection officers and household managers on both sides, told a different story. Two calendars managed separately were periodically synchronized for the occasions when joint appearance was required and were maintained in their separation for all the time between those occasions. A former private secretary who worked on the Wales household for 2 years in the mid-1980s described the specific logistical complexity of managing a household in which the couple's separate preferences had to be accommodated without the accommodation being visible as separation. The complication was not just logistical, it was the complication of a system that is maintained by people who understand what the system is concealing and who maintain it. Because the institutional framework provides no alternative, because they are indifferent to what the concealment costs. He described a specific occasion on which Diana had been told that Charles would be Highgrove for a weekend that she had understood was going to be a joint family weekend. He said she received the information that Charles's schedule had changed, that he would be spending the weekend at Highgrove with his own program, specific quality of reception that he found difficult to describe, but that he settled on the word settled for. Not surprised, not newly hurt. Settled into the familiar pattern of a pain that had become the ordinary condition of her daily life rather than a specific acute event. Family weekends at Highgrove with the boys, when they happened, had the quality that several staff describe in consistent terms. Effort at normalcy that produced something close to normalcy on the surface, while being maintained by a level of conscious effort from both, principles that the staff who were present could see. William and Harry, small children in those years, present in these scenes as the boys that both parents genuinely loved, and whose well-being both parents were genuinely trying to protect. It is one of the dimensions of the Wales marriage that is most consistently described across the full range of accounts, and that the public narrative has most consistently acknowledged. Both Charles and Diana were genuinely devoted to their sons. Love was real on both sides, and the boys experienced it as real. The household's private dysfunction was experienced by the boys through the specific atmosphere of a home in which the adults were working hard to maintain a surface that was not the reality underneath it. Children experience this atmospheric difficulty without having the analytical framework to name what they are experiencing. William and Harry, absorbed in those years, became the foundation for the very different adult relationships each of them developed with the truth. Parents' marriage. William absorbed it toward the institutional end of the spectrum, forming an understanding that allowed him to function within the monarchy's requirements. Harry absorbed it toward the personal end, forming an understanding that eventually produced in him the need to name what he had felt and understood in ways that the institution could not attain. Both of them had been in the house during the periods that the staff described. Both of them had experienced the specific quality of the household's atmosphere in its managed and its unmanaged moments. Both of them knew the level at which children know things that they cannot yet articulate, more than the institutional management of their parents' history would have preferred them to know. Public image of the Wales marriage across its years was managed with a sophistication that reflected the specific moment in media history occupied. The late 1980s and early 1990s were the period when the celebrity tabloid culture was at its most intrusive and also at its most susceptible to institutional management, because the press was hungry for access, and access could be regulated in ways that shaped images the public received. The royal household's press management operation was not a formal entity in the way that celebrity PR operations are now. It operated through a combination of official palace communications, through the informal relationships between royal staff and sympathetic journalists, through the specific access management that determined which photographers were present at which events and how those events were composed for cameras. The images of Charles and Diana that the public received across the years of the marriage were in significant part product of this management. The photographs in which they appeared together as a couple were composed with care. Photographs of Diana with the boys were managed to show the specific dimensions of her maternal warmth that the institutional narrative found useful. The photographs of Charles and Diana at public events were selected and captioned in ways that constructed the impression of a shared domestic life that the private reality was not providing. Diana understood the photographic machinery before Charles understood that she was learning. She developed, across the first years of the marriage, an extraordinarily sophisticated relationship to the camera that went beyond the formal presentation of a public figure at official events. She learned to use the camera in a way that the institution's press management did not fully, and the institution not fully anticipated that a woman it had brought into the family primarily as a vessel for the continuation dynasty would develop within a few years a public intelligence that surpassed the institutional management of public appearance. Former royal press officer who worked on the Wales communications across the mid-1980s described the growing realization in the palace's communications operation that Diana had developed an understanding of the camera's relationship to public sentiment that was more sophisticated than anything the palace's own communications produced. She understood intuitively, he said, Something about the relationship between images and feeling that the palace's management of images had never had to reckon with, because the people the palace had previously needed to manage in public had not been people who understood the relationship from the inside. Photograph of Diana with an AIDS patient in 1987, shaking hands ungloved in the ward of a London hospital. One of the most consequential images of the decade in terms of its effect on public opinion about the disease. Palace's press management had not engineered this image. Diana had. She had understood what the specific visible act would mean, and she had made, and the photograph ran everywhere and changed in a way that public health campaigns costing millions of pounds had not been able to change. Specific quality of public feeling about AIDS and the people who had it. This was the beginning of the specific tactical use of public appearance that eventually produced the Bashir interview and the Serpentine Gallery. Even Diana was learning in real time across the years of the marriage, specific skill that would eventually allow her to use the institution's own tools against it. Tool was the public's relationship to images of her. The institution had built that relationship because it served the institution's purposes. Relationship ran to Diana personally. When the institution's purposes and Diana's purposes diverged, the relationship ran with Diana. Palace's understanding of this dynamic evolved slowly, too slowly to respond effectively to the specific moves Diana made in the period between Morton book and the Bashir interview. By the time the communications operation understood what had happened, institution's primary asset in managing Diana's public standing had been deployed against the institutional narrative, and the deployment was complete. This is described in various accounts from former palace communications staff, consistent mixture of professional admiration and something that might be described as institutional chagrin. Describe a management operation that had not anticipated the specific intelligence of the person it was managing, had made the fundamental error of treating the person as a function of the institution rather than as an independent intelligence with her own understanding of the tools she was using. The year between the divorce finalization in August of 1996 and Diana's death in August of 1997 is described by the people who were closest to her during that period as the year in which she was most fully herself in the public dimension while being most uncertain in the private one. The public dimension was the landmine campaign. In January of 1997, she traveled to Angola under the auspices of the Red Cross, walked through a partially cleared minefield, sat with survivors, touched the prosthetic limbs of children who had lost their legs, and produced images that ran around the world and that changed the specific way that Diana's presence in a place changed the world's relationship to that place. Political environment around the International Landmine Treaty that was eventually signed in Ottawa in December of that year. Staff who traveled with her to Angola, the small protective and logistics team that accompanied her in the new model of royal travel that the divorce had produced, described the trip in terms that were consistent with the broader description of her public engagement. Present in a way that was genuine rather than performed. She was effective in a way that could not be manufactured. And she was doing work that she understood to be meaningful in the specific sense that she had thought carefully about what she could do and how she could most usefully do it. The private dimension was less settled. The relationship with Dodi Fayed, which began in July of 1997, described by people around her at the time, in terms that suggest something more complex than the simple romance the press narrative constructed. From it, she was, by Burrell's account, a woman in the year after her divorce who was looking for the ordinary private life, that her marriage had not attained the domestic ease, the relationship that did not require management or performance, or the suspension of her honest self. Warmth that she had spent 15 years looking for in a household, where the structure of the marriage made it unavailable. Whether the relationship with Dodi was developing towards something more serious, or whether it was the kind of relationship that the freedom of her post-divorce situation had allowed her to explore without the full weight of consequence that relationships carry inside royal formal structures, is something the people who knew her at the time give varying accounts of. The accounts agree on is that she was, in the summer of 1997, moving through a phase of her life that felt different from any previous phase. The lifting of the institutional constraints had produced a quality of possibility that she had not felt since before the engagement. The specific freedom of being able to make her own choices without reference to an institutional management operation was something she was experiencing with genuine appreciation. The letter she had written to Burrell in the autumn of 1996, letter about the most dangerous phase and the car accident and the brake failure, exists in the record as one of the most debated documents of the Diana story. Its authenticity has been established, interpretation has been disputed, whether it represents a genuine fear based on specific knowledge, whether it represents the distress of someone who had been inside a hostile institutional relationship for 15 years and whose fears had taken on specific form, whether there is something else it represents that the available evidence does not allow a confident conclusion about. The letter establishes, beyond the dispute about what it means, is that Diana in the autumn of 1996 was a woman who understood herself to be in danger and who made a record of that understanding. The making of the record is itself the significant act. She had made records before, the audio tapes, the Morton book, the Bashir interview. She understood the value of records, and she understood the specific intelligence that had been shaped by a childhood inside concealment and a marriage inside managed silence. Records persist in ways that the people who would prefer them not to persist cannot fully prevent. She was in the Pont de l'Alma underpass on August 31, 1997, in the early morning hours. Car carrying her and Dodi Fayed and the driver, Henri Paul, crashed into the pillar at speed and she was fatally injured. She died in the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris at 4 in the morning local time. Palace managed the aftermath with the skill it had developed across 15 years of managing the Wales marriage. Specific management of Diana's death and its immediate consequences, decisions about where her body would be taken and how the announcement would be made, and what the formal royal response would be, managed with institutional efficiency. The gap between that institutional efficiency and the public grief that erupted in the week that followed, the most visible evidence in living memory of the distance between the institution's relationship to Diana and the public's relationship to Diana. Public's grief was not managed. It could not be managed because it was a genuine collective response to a personal loss. Genuine collective responses to personal losses do not have management channels. Flowers that arrived at the gates of Kensington Palace in the days after her death, flowers that eventually numbered millions of individual offerings laid by people who had come from across the country and across the world, represented something the palace had to reckon with in real time, without the preparation that its management operations typically provided. Queen's address to the nation, delayed until the evening before the funeral because the institutional default was the management of public communication rather than the responsive public communication that the specific emotional scale of the public grief required, been described as a near miss for the monarchy. The specific failure of the palace's initial response to Diana's death, silent removal of the royals from London, the flag not flying at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, institutional caution that read to the public as indifference, was the most complete evidence in the Wales marriage's public history of the gap between how the institution understood its relationship to the public and how the public understood its relationship to Diana. 20 years after her death, the palace continues to manage her memory with the same long-term patience it applied to managing her life. Annual commemorations, the official acknowledgements of her charitable legacy, the photographs of her sons at the events that carry her name, formal incorporation of her into the institutional narrative as a figure whose contribution to the monarchy's relationship with ordinary people, acknowledged and honored. These are the dimensions of her memory that the institution can work with. Dimensions it cannot fully work with are the ones this account has examined: the specific history of the marriage, parallel relationship that structured it, the mental health distress that was witnessed and unaddressed, managed silence that lasted 13 years, the record she made of what she knew, 23 million people who received her account as true, and have carried the receiving as true into the decades since. Institution manages the present. Diana managed the record. The record persists in ways the management cannot fully address because the management cannot unsay what she said or remove from the public memory the specific voice in which she said it. This is the story the staff finally speak. In a single testimony, not in a coordinated disclosure, in the accumulation of accounts given at different times by different people, each of them adding pieces to a picture that was always more complete than the institution intended, and less complete than the full truth would require. The picture shows a marriage that was built on a prior commitment that was not disclosed to the woman who entered it. It shows a household managed by people who understood what they were concealing, and who had no institutional mechanism for doing anything other than continuing the concealment. It shows the woman who survived 15 years inside an institution that had every interest in keeping her silent, and who eventually found a way to say what she knew in her own voice to an audience that was prepared to receive it. Marriage ended formally in 1996. Diana died in 1997. The institution continued. The record continues with it. Staff saw, across all the years they saw it, was a woman who understood more than anyone around her expected her to understand, carried that understanding with more patience than the situation should have required of anyone, and who eventually found the moment and the form and the audience for the saying of what she knew. The saying is permanent. Institution's management of its consequences is ongoing. Those two things will coexist for as long as the record exists and as long as people are looking at it. If you have watched this complete account, thank you for your attention and your time. The story has been told in pieces across 30 years, through books and interviews, and the slow accumulation of testimony from the people who were present in the rooms where history was made, and who have, with varying degrees of completeness and at various personal costs, added their pieces to the available picture. What we have tried to do here is hold those pieces together in the form that allows the picture to be seen whole or as close to whole as the available evidence allows. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet done so. Press the notification bell. For comment. The stories we cover here are the ones that have been managed with institutional patience and considerable resource. Intend to keep looking at what the management has placed in the background and to keep telling it in the full form it deserves. Diana understood that institutions manage the present. She spent 15 years making certain the record held the past. We are here because the record holds. The sequence of 1992 deserves its own accounting because the year was not, despite how it has sometimes been described, a sudden collapse. It was the visible surface of something that had been building for a decade. The way it built, and the specific decisions made by specific people across the preceding years, much a part of the story as the specific events of that annus horribilis itself. Andrew Morton had been working on the Diana story for several years before the book was published. His access to the palace had been managed in the formal way that royal press access was managed, through official channels, through the controlled occasions of public engagement, through the careful cultivation of relationships with people in the household who were willing to provide background without going on record. He understood by the late 1980s the Wales marriage was not what the official account described, and he understood that the gap between the official account and the private reality was a significant journalistic story that was also, in the specific terms that political accounts use, a story about power and its management of those who could not challenge it directly. The connection with James Colthurst, intermediary who carried questions to Diana and recordings back to Morton, was the specific mechanism that allowed the book to happen. Colthurst was one of Diana's oldest friends, someone she trusted in the specific way she trusted the small number of people who had known her before public transformation, who were loyal to her person rather than to any institutional role she occupied. He was a doctor by training and a person of discretion by character, and he was the person through whom she chose to channel her most extensive and unguarded account of her own life. The sessions in which she made the recordings are described in the accounts available, periods of considerable emotional intensity. She recorded alone in her bedroom without anyone else present. She spoke to the recording device as she might speak to a trusted confidant, directly, without the performance of managed speech, out the careful selection of words that public communication requires. Recordings contain passages of raw feeling alongside passages of specific factual testimony. Combination is what makes them credible, in the way that a merely factual account or a merely emotional account would not be. She described her bulimia and when it began and why. She described the self-harm and what she was trying to communicate with it. She described Charles and the specific quality of his relationship to her, warmth that was occasional and contingent, and the withdrawal that was the more typical register of his engagement. She described Camilla and what she knew about the relationship and when she had known it, and what the knowing had cost her. She described the palace and the specific ways its management machinery had operated in the years of her marriage. Accounts of what it cost her to make these recordings, given by people who were around her in that period, consistent in describing a woman who was making a calculated decision to do something that she understood would be irreversible. She was not making the recordings out of impulse or crisis. She was making them because she had decided that the time had come to make a record in a form that could not be managed, and the decision once made produced in her the specific quality of settled purpose that people who knew her well describe as characteristic of her at her most resolved. The book was published in June of 1992. The palace denied Diana's involvement. Prime Minister John Major made a statement in the House of Commons that described the marriage as having been under strain for some time, and that affirmed the formal separation of the couple. The separation had been, by the available accounts, a private operational reality for years. Public announcement made it official, and the official announcement changed the frame through which everything that followed was received. Camillagate tape appeared in public in January of 1993. It had been recorded 3 years earlier. Amateur radio enthusiasts in Britain had been recording conversations intercepted from mobile phones and car phone networks since the mid-1980s, and the technology existed to intercept and record the specific frequency used by the Wales's mobile communications. How many such recordings were made and how many have been suppressed or destroyed is not fully known. Camillagate tape was one that survived and that found its way, through a route involving overseas publications and eventually British newspapers, to the public record. The content of the tape has been quoted widely in the years since its publication. Specific exchange about Charles's wish to be reincarnated as Camilla's tampon was the detail that ran in every newspaper because it was the tale that was most vivid and most undeniable in what it told the public about the relationship between the two speakers. The broader content of the recording, the sustained intimacy of the full conversation, specific quality of the voices, and their relationship to each other was the more significant evidence. Conversation was between two people who had a long and specific and ongoing intimate relationship. Relationship was not what the palace had claimed it was or not claimed it was, depending on which management formulation you were considering. Charles's authorized biography by Jonathan Dimbleby came out in October of 1994, and the accompanying documentary aired on ITV. Decision to give access to an authorized biographer and to confirm in a documentary interview he had been in a relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles before the marriage, and that the relationship had resumed after the marriage had irretrievably broken down, was a management decision of a specific kind, the management of inevitable disclosure through controlled timing. Facts were in the public record. The denial was no longer viable. Managing the confirmation meant choosing the form and the framing and the timing in ways that served the rehabilitation narrative the palace needed to construct. Framing Charles offered in the Dimbleby documentary was precise. He had been faithful until the marriage had irretrievably broken down. Phrase placed the resumption of the Camilla relationship after a threshold of breakdown, rather than as a concurrent element of the marriage from very early stage. The framing was not consistent with what Diana had said in the Morton book and with what people around the marriage had consistently described, but the framing was what was offered, and the palace's communications operation deployed considerable resources in the following months to ensure the framing was received as the definitive account. Diana's response to the Dimbleby documentary's revelation was the Serpentine Gallery evening in June of 1994. She had known the documentary was coming. She had prepared for it. The black dress and the specific timing and the solitary glamour of the appearance, all decisions made by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. She was not responding to the documentary with a counter-narrative. She was responding with presence, with the specific visual statement that the institution's rehabilitation of Charles required the public to accommodate, and the visual statement the public received was of a woman who was not retreating. Preparation for the Bashir interview was considerably longer and more complex than the Serpentine evening. It began in various ways. In the years following the Morton book, when Diana understood that the book had changed something in the public's relationship to her, but had not completed the account she needed to give. The Morton book was her account in her own words, but not in her own voice, delivered directly to a public audience, not in the unmediated form that would allow the audience to assess her as a witness in real time. Sheer interview was designed to be that form. The specific elements of the preparation, choice of interviewer, to the choice of timing, to the specific questions that she knew would be asked and had thought carefully about how to answer were all the product of a woman who had spent 3 years since the Morton book learning from the specific ways the institutional management had responded to it and calculating what would be required to make the next move in a form that could not be managed in the same ways. Choice of Martin Bashir as interviewer was by various accounts partly the product of his specific approach to her in the preceding months. He had cultivated the relationship with the same patience she was applying to her own preparation, meeting with her over a period of months, demonstrating a specific kind of trustworthiness that was different from the institutional trustworthiness the palace required and closer to the personal trustworthiness that Diana's experience with the Morton process had told her she could work with. Recording took place over 2 evenings in October and November of 1995 in a sitting room at Kensington Palace. Specific conditions of the recording, the lighting and the camera positions, and the physical arrangement of the space considered carefully in advance. Diana wore a blue suit and had her hair done, and had given careful thought to every visible dimension of the appearance. She understood with the sophistication that several years of learning the camera's relationship to public sentiment had given her. The visual presentation needed to convey. It needed to convey credibility. Not the managed credibility of a formal palace appearance. Presentation of credibility is achieved through formality and ceremony, and the institutional authority that surrounds a royal engagement. Credibility required for this appearance was a different kind, the specific credibility of a private person speaking plainly about a personal experience in a form that the audience would receive as direct and unperformed. The eye makeup she wore in the interview, dark smoky lines that made her eyes look larger and more intense on camera, has been described by various accounts as a calculated choice. She was aware of how she photographed. She was aware of what the specific quality of directness she was going for required visually. Preparation was thorough in every dimension that the preparation for such a moment can be thorough. Specific answers she gave to Bashir's questions were the product of considerable prior thought. The question about whether she had had an affair and her confirmation that she had had a relationship with James Hewitt was an answer she had decided to give as a disclosure that preempted the management of that fact by the institutional side. If she acknowledged it herself in this context, institutional deployment of the affair as a counter-narrative to her account of the marriage would be diffused. She was not naive about what the acknowledgement would cost her in terms of public sympathy. She had calculated that the cost was manageable, given the broader context the interview established. Most important answers in the interview were not the most dramatic ones. They were the specific answers she gave to questions about the marriage's structure, about the parallel relationship, about her own understanding of her situation inside the institution. These answers were precise and controlled in a way that the more emotional passages of the interview were not, and the precision was the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about what she needed to say and how she needed to say it. The interview was a strategic document as much as a personal testimony. It was a testimony delivered by someone who understood the rules of the institution well enough to know which specific facts, delivered in which specific form, would be most difficult for the institutional management to counter. Sentence about 3 people in the marriage was the most famous of these facts. It was not the only one. After the broadcast, the palace moved quickly. The Queen's letter to Charles and Diana in December was the institutional acknowledgement that the interview had changed the position in a way that could not be managed back to the previous status. The letter directed them to divorce. Direction was presented as the Queen's personal intervention. It was also the institution's assessment that the marriage's continued nominal existence was now creating more management problems than its dissolution. Diana did not want the divorce. The consistent account of people who knew her well. She had said this before the interview, and the interview had not changed the core of her feeling about it. Her trainer and confidant Jenny Rivet, who knew her well in this period, said later that Diana loved Charles. She had fallen in love with a man who had not loved her back in the same form, and who had sustained throughout the marriage a relationship with another woman, but she had loved the man she had married, and she had wanted the marriage to work. Wanting had outlasted the evidence that the wanting could produce the thing it was looking for. Divorce was finalized in August of 1996. She received a settlement and retained Kensington Palace. She lost the HRH title. She lost the formal protection of the palace's management machinery. She gained the specific and strange freedom of someone who has been inside an institution for 15 years and has been released from it, enormous in some dimensions, limited in others, uncertain in ways that the institutional structure had concealed behind its management. Over the years since Diana's death, testimony from the people who worked in the Wales household and in the adjacent spaces of the royal institution has accumulated in a form that allows a reasonably complete picture to be drawn. The picture is not entirely consistent. Different people saw different things. Different people have different reasons for saying what they say and for framing what they say in the ways they frame it. The assessment of their testimony requires the same kind of critical attention that all testimony requires. What the testimony shares, across its inconsistencies, is a set of structural observations that appear in enough accounts to be treated as reliable descriptions of the Wales marriage private reality. The household operated as two separate operations that were periodically required to appear as one. Management of that requirement absorbed considerable human effort. The people who performed the management were aware of what they were concealing and had no institutional channel for addressing their awareness. Distress of the princess was visible to the people around her and was managed rather than addressed by the institutional structure. Parallel relationship was known to a significant number of staff and was managed through a combination of discretion and arrangement that required active participation from people at multiple levels of both households. Former footman who worked at Kensington Palace for 3 years gave an interview to a royal historian in the period after Diana's death in which he described the specific quality of working in the household. He was careful to distinguish between his responsibilities and his observations, between what he was told and what he saw, between what he understood at the time and what he understood retrospectively. Care itself was significant. It was the care of someone who understood that what he had witnessed mattered, and who was conscious of the obligations that witnessing imposes. He described the household as one that had a specific kind of atmosphere, a specific set of registers that shifted depending on who was present and what was happening. Formal register when the house was performing for external guests or for public occasions. Domestic register in the private hours when the family was together with the children. A third register that he found harder to characterize, something between the domestic and the formal, something that appeared in the periods when neither principal was performing for the other, but when they were in the same space, and the space had to accommodate two people who were not at ease together. He described this third register as the one that told you most about the marriage's reality. Not the fights, were specific events with specific causes, not the formal occasions which were managed precisely. The third register, one that appeared in the ordinary moments when the management was not fully engaged. Register of two people who had come to the specific accommodation of individuals who are going to share the same institutional space, regardless of the private reality, and who have decided, with the consistency that comes from having made the same decision so many times it has come automatic, to manage that space without requiring anything of each other that the space does not require. Former lady-in-waiting to one of the senior royal ladies described a conversation she had with Diana in the early 1990s that stayed her for years afterward. The conversation happened at a gathering that mixed senior royal household figures with members of the broader aristocratic circle. Diana had found her in a corridor away from the main party and had talked to her briefly and directly. The experience of being inside the institution. She said that the thing nobody had prepared her for was the loneliness of being surrounded by people whose loyalty ran to the institution rather than to her. She said that she had spent years in a household where the staff reported to the palace and the palace's interests and her interests were not the same interests, and the specific effect of this over years, the experience of being watched without being seen, of being managed without being cared for, being present in an enormous amount of company and being, in the sense that matters, alone. Lady-in-waiting said she did not know what to say in response because she recognized, from the inside of the institutional world Diana was describing, that the description was accurate. Institution does not care for its members in the way that families care for their members. Difference between what the institution provides and what a person needs from the people around them is the gap that produces the specific loneliness Diana was describing. She had married what looked from outside like a family and found from inside that it was an institution. Paul Burrell's position in the household was unusual in the specific way that his loyalty and his proximity combined to make it unusual. He had been employed by the royal family in various capacities since his teens, had been footman to the Queen, had worked at Highgrove, come to Diana as her butler in 1987, with a long institutional background and a genuine personal attachment to her that developed across the decade he served her. The combination produced someone who understood both the institutional context and the personal reality in a way that gave him access to a full picture that few other people in the household had. Present for the fights and the aftermath of the fights. He was present for the phone calls and the correspondence and the management of the schedules. He was present for Diana's distress in its acute forms and in its chronic form. Present in the kitchen, in the early mornings, and in the corridors during the night. He understood the specific texture of the daily life of the household in ways that required his direct, continuous, physically present knowledge. He described Diana as someone who treated the people who were loyal to her with a warmth and a generosity that was genuine and that produced, in those people, the specific kind of loyalty that is more than professional. She remembered things about their lives. She asked after their families. She noticed when something was wrong with a member of staff and asked about it directly in a way that was not the formal inquiry of a senior employer. The specific attentive concern of someone who had genuine emotional investment in the people around her. This quality, direct personal warmth that she extended to staff as well as to strangers in hospitals and landmine fields, described so consistently across so many accounts that it deserves to be taken seriously as a real characteristic, rather than as a hagiographic embellishment. She was not uniformly pleasant. The accounts describe her capacity for the sharper interactions that the difficult to work for. Accounts also describe the perfectionism that extended to the staff, the specific demands that came from a woman whose public presentation required high standards and who held the people responsible for it to those standards. She was not easy. She was also, in a way that the more critical accounts from the palace's side have consistently undersold, genuinely kind. Kind in the performed way of someone maintaining a public presentation of kindness. Kind in the way of someone who understood from the inside what it felt like to not receive it, and who therefore gave it freely when it was in her power to give it. The combination of genuine warmth and real difficulty is what the full range of staff accounts produces. Is a more complex and more human portrait than either the hagiography or the counter-narrative provides. It is the portrait that emerges when you lay the accounts next to each other and look at what they share and what they say independently. Diana left behind a larger record than any previous figure in the history of the British royal family. This is not hyperbole. Combination of the Morton book, the Bashir interview, the audio recordings that were released after her death, correspondence that has been quoted in various accounts, and the testimony of the staff and friends and observers who knew her, adds up to a documentary record of a person's private experience into the British royal family that has no precedent in scope or specificity. Record exists in part because she made it deliberately. The Morton tapes were deliberate. The Bashir interview was deliberate. Even the letter to Burrell about the most dangerous phase was in its way deliberate. A woman who had learned to make records, making a record of her current understanding of her situation. Record also exists because the people she trusted with pieces of it honored the trust in the specific way it could be honored, not by keeping it permanently secret, which would have allowed the institutional management to occupy the space the record would otherwise have occupied, but by waiting for the appropriate moment and then adding their pieces to the publicly available picture in ways that built over time toward the completeness that no single account could provide. The institutional response to the existence of this record has been, across the 30 years since her death, the most sophisticated management operation the palace has conducted in the modern era. Management has required the simultaneous acknowledgement of some dimensions of the record and the careful contextualizing of others. Has required the construction of a narrative frame in which Diana's suffering is acknowledged, her charitable legacy is honored, specific institutional dimensions of her suffering, the ways the palace's management machinery contributed to the conditions that produced suffering are understood as a historical difficulty that the institution has learned from and moved past. The learning from it is claimed. Specific evidence of the learning is less clear. The techniques that Diana described in the Morton recordings and the Bashir interview, briefing operations, the management of public narrative, The deployment of institutional machinery against individuals whose public standing threatened the institutional narrative were all techniques that Harry described in Spare as still operative a generation later when applied to his own wife and to him. The consistency between the two accounts from mother and son, from two people who experienced the institution in different decades and in very different personal contexts, the most significant challenge to the institutional narrative that the management has been unable to fully address. Management has met this challenge by treating the two accounts as fundamentally different in kind. Diana's account is given the status of a tragedy that has been acknowledged and learned from. Harry's account is given the status of a personal grievance that is colored by his specific situation and his specific choices. Differential treatment allows the institution to honor Diana's memory in the managed form it prefers, while managing Harry's account in the managed form it requires, without acknowledging the structural consistency between the two accounts that is the most significant thing about them. Considered together, the staff who were inside the institution in Diana's time and who are still alive, staff who have served in the years since, carry various degrees of knowledge and various degrees of willingness to speak about what they know. Culture of discretion that royal service requires has not disappeared. The agreements that staff sign, combination of formal obligation and informal pressure that maintains the culture of silence, are still operative. What has changed, across the 30 years since Diana's death, is the public's expectation of what the institution is willing to conceal and what it is required to acknowledge. The specific shift that the Wales marriage produced in the public's relationship to the royal family, the erosion of the automatic deference that allowed the institution to manage its private reality without public scrutiny, permanent in ways the management has been able to contain but not reverse. Public that watched Diana in the Bashir interview is not the same public that watched her at the wedding. Public that watched the wedding is not the public that will watch whatever royal event comes next. Specific quality of Diana's achievement in the Bashir interview, the quality that makes it durable in ways that other accounts of institutional do not achieve, was the quality of someone who had prepared for 15 years to say something in the most effective possible form, and then said. Preparation was visible in the interview to anyone who looks at it with attention to the craft of public communication, the controlled pace, specific choices of word and emphasis, the management of the emotional moments so that they served the substance rather than overwhelming it, precision of the central sentence about three people in a marriage. It was a performance. In the sense that all public communication is a performance. It was also the most honest performance in the modern history of the British royal family, because it was the performance of someone saying what they actually knew and what it had actually cost them, in a form that was designed to communicate rather than to manage. The institution manages by managing what the public knows. Diana changed what the public knew. The change is permanent. The management since has been the management of permanence rather than the management of ignorance, and managing permanence is a considerably harder problem than managing ignorance. The institution is still working on it. Work will continue for as long as the record exists and as long as there are people who take the record seriously. Count has been one of those attempts. The staff who saw what they saw across 15 years of the Wales marriage were not witnesses to a simple story. They were witnesses to the specific complexity of an institution managing the private lives of the people inside it, the specific tools and the specific priorities that institutions of that kind deploy, to the specific cost that management imposes on the people who are being managed, were witnesses to a woman who survived that management with remarkable resources and who eventually found the form in which her account of what she had witnessed could be made permanent. They were also witnesses to a marriage, which is to say a relationship between two human beings, all the complexity and specificity that the word implies. They saw people who were genuinely incompatible being required by institutional necessity to function as a unit. They saw the specific forms that incompatibility takes when it cannot be acknowledged. They saw what it costs to maintain a surface when the surface is not what is underneath. The cost was real. The people who paid it were real. Institution that required the payment is real and continues. The record of what the payment was is also real. It is permanent in ways the institution has not been able to manage away, which is the specific and durable legacy of what Diana managed to achieve in the years between the phone call in a room in Kensington Palace and the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of panorama in November of 1995. The management continues. The record holds. Is a fundamental miscalculation at the center of the Wales marriage story, and it is a miscalculation that the institution has not, 35 years since the engagement was announced, fully reckoned with. Miscalculation was the institution's assessment of Diana Spencer. The assessment was shaped by the criteria through which the institution evaluated potential brides for the heir to the throne, and those criteria were developed over centuries of experience with women who entered the royal household and who accommodated themselves to the household's requirements, with the compliance that the institutional structure rewarded. Criteria were correct for the women those criteria were designed to evaluate. They were not correct for Diana Spencer. Institution saw a 19-year-old of good family, no significant romantic history, attractive, friendly, from a background with the right connections, young enough to be managed and formed by the environment she would enter. It saw a candidate who met the requirements. It did not see, because the criteria it used were not designed to detect, specific combination of intelligence and emotional acuity and survivor's determination that was already present in the young woman who stood in corridor at Althorpe and told Charles that she had felt his loneliness about Mountbatten. Specific qualities that made Diana unsuited to the role the institution needed her to fill were the same qualities that had produced her capacity to survive an extremely difficult childhood. The father who did not know how to show warmth, the mother who left when she was 6, custody battle that placed her on one side of a divide and required her to choose, specific way that children of divorce are required to choose, who she was loyal to in a situation that should not have required loyalty. Boarding school years in which she was identified as not academically able and filed accordingly. These were not a preparation for a managed public life of compliance. They were a preparation for a kind of intelligence that does not sit well inside managed structures. She was perceptive about people in ways the institution did not require. Institution's management machinery worked on the assumption that the people inside it would not fully see what the machinery was doing. The specific ways information was managed and access was controlled and communication was structured would be legible to the people on the inside only in the partial forms that the management intended. Diana saw the machinery, not immediately and not completely, with an increasing clarity that the institutional management, which was not designed to be seen, could not prevent once the looking began. She started looking because the phone call in a room in Kensington Palace gave her a specific piece of knowledge that required an explanation. The process of finding the explanation required a systematic assessment of what was actually happening around her. The assessment, once begun, not stop. She had the specific quality of attention that childhood inside a household of managed realities had produced. Attention of someone who has learned that the surface is not the truth, and that the truth is available to be read from the surface by anyone who knows how to read it. The institutional management's response to Diana's perceptiveness was the response that institutions produce when their management is being perceived. More management. The specific forms the increased management took across the years of the marriage. Schedule arrangements, the household structures, the press management that worked to define her public role, in terms that served the institutional narrative, were all responses to the problem of a person who could see what was being managed and who was, slowly, developing the resources to do something with what she saw. The management was effective in the short term and inadequate in the long term. For the same reason, the institutional management of a person who is building the resources to challenge the institutional narrative is a race between the management and the resource building, and the management cannot win if the resource being built is the public's relationship to the person being managed. The institution built Diana's public standing. The public standing ran to Diana personally. The interests of the institution and the interests of Diana diverged. The standing went with Diana. Institution was surprised by this, because the institution had not fully understood what it was building when it built her public presence. Australian tour of 1983 was the first evidence of the scale of what had been built, and the scale was a surprise to everyone, including Diana. Hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane to see her, held signs with her name on them. They pushed toward the barriers to get close to her. When she walked along the barriers, touching hands and crouching to speak to children, the response was personal rather than ceremonial. The response of people who had developed a relationship with a public figure that they experienced as direct and as reflecting something in the figure that was real. The specific quality of her public engagement was unusual. Senior royals had always drawn crowds. Charles drew crowds. Queen drew crowds. But the crowds that came out for Diana had a different character from the crowds that turned out for the formal public engagement of the senior members of the family. They came because of her specifically, because of the specific quality she had demonstrated in public that read, to the people who watched, genuinely personal rather than institutionally performed. A senior aide who had accompanied several royal tours described the Australian tour's specific quality in terms that were careful but honest. He said that in his experience of royal public engagements, crowd's response was typically a response to the institutional significance of the occasion, to the ceremonial weight of the royal presence, cultural meaning of the monarchy that the visit represented. In Australia in 1983, he said, crowd's response was a response to a person. The distinction is not subtle. Institutional significance produces a specific kind of crowd, attentive, respectful, appropriately enthusiastic, held at a formal distance by the shared understanding that the occasion requires the maintenance certain formal register. A crowd responding to a person is different, closer, louder, more urgent, expressing the specific urgency of people who want contact rather than ceremony. Come, not because the occasion has called them, but because the person has. Diana's capacity to produce this response was genuine, in the sense that it came from something real about her, rather than from a managed performance of approachability. Performance existed alongside the reality, and the performance was sophisticated and it was managed. Public could feel the reality underneath it, in the way that audiences can feel genuine emotion underneath performance, even when they cannot articulate what they are feeling. The staff who travelled with the Wales on that Australian tour described Diana's response to the public response. She found it sustaining in a way that nothing else in her life at the time was providing. The specific warmth of large numbers of strangers who expressed genuine feeling toward her was filling something that the marriage had emptied. It is not a comfortable thing to say, but the people who were around her say it consistently. Public gave Diana what her private life had denied her, and the giving was genuine on both sides. Charles watched this on that tour. Accounts describe him as publicly gracious, privately more complex. The complexity was not simple jealousy. By the accounts, jealousy was part of it. It was the specific complexity of a man who had expected his marriage to produce one kind of public presence, and found it producing something significantly more than that. Something that surpassed his own public standing in ways that the institution's management not prepared him for, and that his own emotional relationship with Diana made more rather than less difficult to accommodate. Public dynamic between them on the tour was managed with the professionalism that both of them brought to public occasions, appeared together at the required moments, with the required warmth, navigated the shared engagements with the practiced ease of two people who had been doing this long enough to perform it well even when the performance was effortful. What the cameras did not show, and what the staff who were present in the private moments between public occasions describe, was the specific quality of the atmosphere in those private moments. The effortfulness was visible to the people close enough to see it. Ease that the public occasions required was produced by effort rather than arising naturally, and the effort, sustained over 3 weeks of intense public exposure, had a cost that was visible to the staff in the specific ways that sustained effort at the maintenance of a surface has a cost, in the quality of the interactions in the private hours, texture of the conversations when there was no performance requirement, particular tiredness, that is the tiredness not of physical exertion, but of the sustained management of the gap between the surface and what is underneath it. This is the most complete account the available evidence supports of the Wales marriage's private reality, as it was experienced by the people inside it, visible from the outside only in the specific ways that people with direct access to the private reality have been willing to describe. The evidence is not complete. It cannot be complete. Some of what happened in the private rooms of Kensington Palace and Highgrove and the other royal residences across 15 years has gone permanently into the silence that the institution maintained, and that some of the people who part of the management chose to maintain beyond the end of their service is available, is sufficient to describe the structural reality of the marriage, built on a prior commitment that was not disclosed to the woman entering it. maintained by an institutional management machinery that had no mechanism for addressing the specific human costs the structure produced, inhabited by a woman who survived it through a combination of remarkable personal qualities, and who eventually found the form in which her account of what she had experienced could be made permanent and public in a way the institution could not manage before it was received. Management continues, the record holds. The staff who saw what they saw are still, in various forms and with various degrees of completeness, and at various personal costs, adding their pieces to the picture. Picture is more complete than the institution intended, and less complete than the full truth would require. Gap between those two versions of completeness is where the institution still lives, as it has always lived, managing what the public knows against the grain of what happened. What happened was what Diana said happened. The telephone call. 15 years of carrying the knowledge. The bracelet and the honeymoon journals, and the Highgrove visits, and the fights and the salad dressing. Letter about the most dangerous phase. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds of panorama. 23 million people who received what she said as true. She said it. The record holds it. The institution manages around it. Is the story the staff finally speak. There is a specific quality of life inside an institution that has decided to manage the truth of your situation rather than address it, and Diana described this quality in the Morton recordings with a specificity that has not been fully incorporated into the public account of the Wales marriage. She described it not primarily in terms of specific dramatic events, fights and the discoveries and the confrontations that the narrative coverage of the marriage has focused on. She described it in terms of the daily texture of a managed life, what it felt like to wake up in the morning inside a household where the person who supposed to be your primary relationship was maintaining a different primary relationship in a space you could see but could not name, and where every mechanism available to you for naming it had been structured to manage the naming rather than to receive it honestly. Texture of this is harder to describe than the specific events, and it is also more important for understanding what the marriage was and what it cost. The specific events, the bracelet and the phone call and the Camillagate tape and the Dimbleby confession, are the punctuation of the story. Body of the story is the daily life that produced the punctuation, the years of breakfasts and public engagements and household schedules and meetings with staff and the private hours in the apartment at Kensington Palace that were not dramatic and were not documented, and that accumulated day by day into the full weight of what Diana was carrying. She described the specific loneliness of it in terms that come back to the same structural observation from different angles across the full body of her testimony. Loneliness of being surrounded by people whose loyalty was to the institution rather than to her, in a house that was formally shared but operationally separate, performing a public role that required warmth and connection while the private life behind the performance was providing neither. The staff who were loyal to her personally, people she had sought out, rather than inherited from the institutional structure, understood the loneliness and responded to it in the ways they could. They were present in the corridors and the kitchen, and the private sitting room, with the people she talked to, in the early mornings and the late evenings, provided the specific continuity of familiar presence that the marriage was not providing, but staff, however loyal and however warm, not a substitute for the domestic intimacy that a marriage is supposed to provide. The staff who genuinely cared for Diana were aware of this and aware that their caring, however real, could not fill the specific absence that was at the center of her life. The absence was not just Charles and his unavailability. It was the institutional context that had produced the unavailability and that had no interest in addressing it. Management of the absence was the daily work of the household. The schedules that maintained the separation, press arrangements that constructed the public image of a shared domestic life, formal occasions that periodically brought the couple together for the purpose of the public record, household staff who maintained the house in a state of readiness for the formal occasions, while managing in the intervals between them, daily reality of a house in which the principals were living parallel rather than joint lives. Various members of the household have described, across the years since Diana's death, the specific skills that this management required, not the formal skills of royal service, protocol and the presentation and the management of public engagement, the informal skills of maintaining a household that was performing something different from what it was. Specific attention required to manage the schedules so that the separation was maintained without being visible. Management of information flows so that the staff on Charles's side and the staff on Diana's side did not create visible evidence of the two separate operations they were each part of. These are not simple skills, require a sustained awareness of what the situation is and what the situation is supposed to appear to be. The management of the gap between those two things, sustained over years, has a specific psychological cost for the people doing it. Cost is not often discussed in accounts of the Wales marriage, because the accounts of the Wales marriage focus, understandably, on the principles. People who managed the household across those years were doing something that required of them a sustained complicity with a management of truth that not all of them were comfortable with. Some of them were comfortable with it, because the institutional culture of royal service had shaped their understanding of their role in ways that made discretion and the management of awkward realities feel like professionalism rather than moral compromise. These were people who had been in royal service for years and who had a formed understanding of what the role required that did not include examining whether what the role required was producing harm to the people whose household they were managing. Others were less comfortable. Specific quality of their discomfort shows in the accounts they have given across the years since Diana's death, care with which they frame what they say, in the specific way they distinguished between what they were required to do in their professional role and what they understood about what was happening in the household they were managing. The distinction matters. Management of the Wales household was not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. The operation of an institutional culture that had developed its practices over a long period and that applied those practices to the specific situation of the Wales marriage with the same automatic efficiency that it applied them to everything else. People involved were not uniformly cynical or uniformly indifferent to the human cost of what they were maintaining. People inside an institution that had structured their roles in ways that left very little space for the human response to the human cost. Diana's awareness of this dynamic, her understanding of the specific way the institution managed the people inside it, documented in her own testimony, and in the testimony of people who were close to her. She described it with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years studying a system from the inside, who had watched the system apply itself to her with a consistency that allowed her to understand how it worked, even when she could not fully see it working. She understood by the end of the marriage that the institution was not malevolent in any simple sense. It was not pursuing her specifically out of hostility, though it was capable of specific hostility when her public standing became a threat to the institutional narrative. It was pursuing its own interests with the efficiency that institutions develop when they have been operating for a long time and have refined their practices through successive applications. The pursuit of institutional interests produced damage to the individuals in path not because the institution intended damage but because the institution had not built into its operation any mechanism for registering or counting for the damage. The absence of such a mechanism is the most damning thing Diana's testimony establishes about the institution she was inside, not the deliberate cruelty, which would have been more legible and therefore more resistible. The structural indifference. Operation of an institutional system that produced human cost as a byproduct without having developed, in several hundred years of continuous operation, any interest in accounting for the byproduct. She said it plainly in the Bashir interview. She said that she understood what the institution was and what it required, and that she was not asking it to be different, because she had given up on the possibility of it being different. She was asking the record to show what it had been. She was delivering the record in the most durable form she could construct, which was her own voice in a public medium. A moment she had spent 15 years preparing to an audience she had spent 15 years earning. The record shows it, 30 years on. Record shows it in the form Diana gave it, and in the form the staff who were there have been adding to it. Institution manages the present in which the record is received. The record itself does not change. What persists is what she said. Persists is the account of the people who saw it from the inside. What persists is the gap between the surface the institution presented and the reality that the record documents. The gap is the specific measure of what the marriage cost, not just Diana and Charles and the boys, the institution itself in the specific currency of public trust that institutions of this kind survive on. The trust has not recovered fully, has recovered partially, through the management operations that the institution has conducted with skill and patience across the decades since. Diana's death, but the specific quality of uncritical public trust that existed before the Wales marriage became publicly visible has not returned, cannot return, because the public that received Diana's testimony is not the same public that watched the wedding and believed the fairy tale. Public, and the generations that have formed their understanding of the monarchy through the record Diana made, carries a conditional relationship to the institution that the institution is still learning to manage. The management continues, the record holds. One dimension of the Wales marriage that the staff accounts return to with a consistency that stands outside the institutional management of the story is the dimension of William and Harry as children in the household, not as subsequent inheritors of the marriage consequences, which is the frame through which their adult lives are typically discussed in relation to their parents. As small children who were present in the rooms and the corridors and the daily life of a household whose emotional reality was different from surface presentation. Staff who were responsible for the nursery at Kensington Palace and at Highgrove across the middle 1980s describe William and Harry in terms that are universally warm. They were children who were well loved by both parents, each in their different way. The love was genuine and was felt by the children as genuine. Diana's physical warmth with them, holding and the playing, and the specific attention she paid to their emotional lives in ways that were unusual for parents of her class and background was something the staff who worked in the nursery describe with consistent warmth. Charles's relationship with his sons was more formal in its expression but was by the accounts real in its feeling, not the kind of father who spent large amounts of time in the nursery. The occasions he was there were occasions he was genuinely present for. Boys responded to his presence in the way that children respond to the rare attention of a parent who is less consistently available. The specific texture of childhood in that household is described by the staff in terms that are careful about distinguishing between what the children experienced as children, which was primarily the warmth and the love that both parents provided in the forms they were capable of providing, and what the staff experienced as adults in the same household, which included the full picture of what was underneath the surface that the children not receiving. Children do not need to understand the institutional architecture of their parents' marriage to feel its emotional texture. Feel the texture through the specific quality of the adults around them in the unmanaged moments, through the atmosphere that the household creates in the gaps between the formal occasions, through the specific ways the emotional weather of the adults around them reaches them without being explained or named. William and Harry felt the emotional weather of the Wales household from their earliest years, felt it without the analytical framework to name what they were feeling, absorbed it into the specific understanding of the world that children develop through the texture of the household they grow up in. Carried that absorbed understanding into their adult lives, where it has expressed itself differently in each of them, in the ways that the adult experience of the same institutional structures that had shaped their childhood expressed itself. Staff who were in the household in those years and who are willing to speak about what they saw describe the specific care that protects both themselves and the boys they are speaking about. Household in which two children were loved, and also in which two children were absorbing something complicated, without having the tools to process. Complication was not the fights which the children were largely protected from. Complication was the specific quality of the household's emotional texture in the ordinary moments, the managed politeness between the adults, performed normalcy that both parents maintained for the children's benefit. Specific atmospheres of the house on the occasions when the management of the normalcy was most effortful. Children map these textures without knowing they are mapping them. The maps they produced shape the emotional understanding they carry into adulthood. William's map and Harry's map are not the same map because they were different ages and in different developmental stages for different parts of the marriage, and because they had different temperaments and different relationships to the specific people in the household. Both maps were drawn from the same household, and the household was what it was, and the maps show it. Staff who made the household what it was, through their management and their discretion, and their daily labor of maintaining a surface that was the reality underneath, were part of the environment those maps were drawn from. They were not neutral actors in the making of the children's understanding of their family. They were part of the conditions that shaped the understanding, and some of them carry the awareness of this with a specific weight that the accounts their years in the household convey. This is the most personal dimension of the Wales marriage's legacy. It is the dimension the staff accounts address most carefully and most obliquely. Not because it is the most uncomfortable, it is uncomfortable in its own way, but because the privacy of children in a public family is a boundary that the people who care about those children maintain with real commitment, and the staff who cared for William and Harry maintain it with the specific commitment of people who were responsible for those children's well-being, in the daily specific way of people who were there. What they will say consistently. Both boys were genuinely loved. Both parents, in the forms they were capable of, loved their sons. The marriage failed. Household that the marriage produced was not a straightforwardly healthy environment for children in the specific ways described above. The love was real, and the boys felt it as real, and the love is part of the legacy alongside the complexity. Diana's account of her marriage, one she gave in her own voice in November of 1995, was an account of the institutional conditions that made the marriage what it was. It was not primarily an account of what the marriage had cost her boys, because she was protecting them with the same protective instinct that the household staff describe seeing her demonstrate in every interaction with. She spoke about herself and about the institution. She kept her sons as much as the public record allowed out of the testimony she gave. Protection was part of the account too. The management of what her sons would receive from her account, care she took to give them the minimum of what they would need to carry, while giving the public the maximum of what it needed to receive. Itself an act of the specific intelligence this account has been trying to describe. She managed the disclosure as carefully as the institution managed the concealment. She was better at it than anyone expected. The record stands. Institution manages on. The staff who saw what they saw are still here, some of them, still adding their pieces. Pieces form a picture that is not complete and cannot be complete, but it is more complete than the institution intended, and it is in a form that institution has not been able to manage away, because the form is the record Diana made, and the record exists in the voices and the words and the 23 million people who received it and have carried the receiving into the decades since. That is the story the staff finally speak. It is the story that persists regardless of the management, because truth of this kind, spoken by the right person at the right moment to an audience prepared to receive it, does not disappear because institutions prefer silence. It remains. It has always remained. It will remain for as long as the record exists and as long as there are people who take the record seriously, enough to look at it with attention. Diana took the record seriously. She spent 15 years making it. We are here because she did. Counts and testimony that form the basis of this narrative have been drawn from Andrew Morton's Diana, true story in her own words, published posthumously with the original audio recordings in 1997, Paul Burrell's A Royal Duty 2003, and The Way We Were 2006, and The Royal Insider 2026, Ken Waff's Diana, Closely Guarded Secret 2002. Jonathan Dimbleby's Prince Charles, A Biography 1994, Penny Junor's The Duchess 2017 and other biographies, Tina Brown's The Diana Chronicles 2007, the testimony of various unnamed household staff given in interviews to journalists and royal historians across the years since 1997, the text and recording of the Panorama interview of November 1995, text of the Morton audio recordings as released after Diana's death, and the broader body of journalism biography, documentary record that has accumulated around the Wales marriage across the 4 decades since the engagement was announced. Accounts are not uniformly consistent. Testimony about private events given by different people at different times with different degrees of access and different motivations will not be fully consistent, and the picture this narrative constructs from those accounts is the best picture that available evidence supports rather than a claim of certainty about specific events that the evidence does not allow certainty about. The evidence does support, consistently across its inconsistencies, is the structural account of the marriage, its conditions, parallel relationship that was present throughout it, the institutional management machinery that maintained its surface, human cost that the machinery produced, and the record that Diana made of that cost in the years before her death. Structural account is what this narrative has attempted to tell. The staff who saw what they saw, who have added their pieces to the picture across the years, deserve the acknowledgement that this kind of testimony earns. The acknowledgement of celebrity or public standing, but the quieter acknowledgement owed to people who kept their observations faithfully through years when the keeping required the specific discipline of silence, and who added those observations to the record when the adding became possible. They served in rooms where history was made, without cameras and without credit, kept what they saw with the professionalism that royal service requires. Things they saw, and the things they carried, and the things they eventually chose to say, are the record that this account has been built from. Alongside the record Diana made herself, she made her record because she understood that institutions manage the present, and the record holds the past. She was right, the management continues, the record holds. That is the story. It is complete as the available evidence allows, and it stands.